From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Ready?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're rolling. Okay, so today is Saturday, April 13th. We're in Malibu, California. And this is David Cline on behalf of the Southern Oral History Program and the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. And today I will be the interviewer. I'm with John Bishop, videographer, and Willie Leventhal. And Willie, wanted to thank you very much for being part of our project.
You know, it's a
Oh, and the Pacific Ocean is behind us as well.
it's a great honor, and I think that you know, this was a key part of American history and world history, and there are so many lessons for the world to know about how you try and change things without violence. And so I'm more than happy to be a part of this.
Great. Thank you so much. So Willie, I wanted, if I could ask you to start just by telling us about where you grew up and how you grew up and how you may have seen some of the lessons that you learned early on playing out in the work that you chose.
Born in New York in '46, but my dad had just gotten back from World War II. He'd had a very good chiropractic practice in Saginaw, Michigan when he went into war. My mother, who was a teacher and later a college professor at USC, special ed, went back and lived with her family in Staten Island. And when my dad got out, he had to sort of start over again, you know, after a couple of years away for service. And, you know, that was when the migration was happening to California. And apparently he talked to some people in Michigan, and they said, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity out there. Still being in the service, he could fly free out to California, and Dr. Bernard Leventhal is his name. They were both, my parents were members of the NAACP at different times. I don't know at that time, but I know that Hubert Humphrey was his big hero from 1948. In fact, when I worked for George McGovern, took a year in 1972, and we got the nomination over Hubert Humphrey. It took many decades for my father to forgive me for working against Hubert Humphrey, who was his hero of his generation, as many like Jackie Robinson and Martin Luther King and John Kennedy were from my generation. But so we moved to New York, to California. When I was 2, we didn't have much to start with out here, so we lived in Ramona Gardens, which was a federal housing project, probably about 1948. My mother worked in the campaign of the first Hispanic councilman, and then later congressman, but I'm blanking on his name. The federal building is named for him downtown. I'll think of it later. Ed Roybal. She worked in, and I've since become friends with somebody at Cal State LA, did a book about Ed Roybal, and my sister had talked to Ed Roybal before he died. His daughter, Lucille Roybal Allard, is now, has his seat. He remembered my mother. My mother was an activist, and my grandfather had been the assistant superintendent of New York City schools, Morris E. Siegel, and had handled all the veterans retraining and all the vocational education after World War II. So I come from a family of educators. On my mom's side, my dad were also immigrants. His father and mother were immigrants, as my grandparents on both sides, and they had shoe stores. They fixed shoes and they had shoe stores, and then the typical next generation became college educated. My dad was the only one of his generation to be college educated. So we lived in the projects for a couple of years, and I think that shaped me in the sense I saw, they got even pictures in the book you have of you know, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, black kids, all living in fact, the picture from the LA Weekly, I could have had that picture taken anywhere when they chose me as a Person of the Year after I went to the White House for the Civil Rights Concert. And I particularly went back to Murchison Elementary School, which is right up the street from the projects, where my brother and sister went, and I substitute taught when I worked in LAUSD for 5 years. And so those are my roots, East LA, East Los. So I'm culturally, I think, mostly Jewish, but a good bit Hispanic and black, particularly the food for both of those cultures. But anyway, so we moved to North Hollywood. My dad first built, and some of his veterans buddies from the Jewish war veterans, they built a little front to the house we bought, and that was his waiting room, and he used to do his adjustments in the living room. And then he made a little more success, and him and one guy built about an 8-room office in front of our house. My parents then divorced, and I moved with my mom. She was a special ed teacher in the public schools and liked the county special ed program better than the city. And so we ended up first in Westchester and then in the South Bay area. And I think Westchester was a very key event in my life. beyond my family's commitment to quote-unquote liberal of that day, which was a very close bond between Jews and blacks, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund with Jack Greenberg and others, worked with Thurgood Marshall. And my grandfather, as I said in an article, had donated money to the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. My parents were part of the NAACP, as far as membership. My father, as I said, loved Hubert Humphrey. But when I was a Little League baseball player at age 10, most of the kids were Catholic, and they never directed the word kike to me personally, but they used it as kind of a slang negative word. You kike, you this, I'm going to Jew you down. That was also very prevalent in South Bay. Only 3 Jewish families in my high school. Again, never directed at me, and me really not knowing what to make of it, but very painful to a child because, of course, as a child you want to fit in. You don't want people, and of course I didn't understand why they would even say that about my religion, because I liked my parents and the people I met at Temple. They hadn't done anything wrong that I knew of, and and of course at that time within the Catholic Church there was which later changed, and it's a whole different day in the Catholic Church in terms of relations with Israel and Judaism. But in those days there was the Christ killer, that was that aspect, I forget, for a certain time. So came out, and then the next thing that happened, which is tremendously connected to the word kike, was the Jackie Robinson movie, Jackie Robinson story, which I saw at age 5. And here on the screen, there were 2 things that I related to. Baseball, which I loved, still love, and racial prejudice or prejudice towards somebody and mistreatment of somebody more verbally with Robinson in that movie than otherwise. And in the Jackie Robinson movie, which came out this weekend, there's a great scene with Harrison Ford while he tells the Jackie Robinson actor, I was just there and there's a little white boy who's imitating you. And I talked to Andy Young about the movie, and Andy said, the movie was great, best civil rights movie I ever saw. And he said, I thought of you when I saw the movie, thinking of me. And he may have thought, I've been trying to get Jackie's teammates involved with the civil rights game. I was the one that got Andy Young involved through my RBI involvement. Went with him to Cincinnati when he gave the address there at the civil rights game in 2009 or 10. And I didn't identify with Jackie as a ball player. First of all, he was probably the best athlete in the country for many years, maybe of all time. Him and Jim Thorpe were close, but Jackie was an unbelievable athlete. Broad jump 25.6 in 1940. Would have been in the Olympics like his brother Mac, but they had no Olympics that year. What I identified with Jackie Robinson, I try to describe it as, whoa, because by that time, Willie Mays is around, blacks are playing. You don't hear of any, I didn't know anything about this. I was 10 years old, I just knew the blacks were in the big leagues. They were my heroes, some were on the Dodgers. That's all I knew. And I remember the way I describe it is, in my 10-year-old mind, it was the grown-ups didn't tell me about this. They didn't tell me about any of this. The blacks and whites couldn't play baseball. I want to find out more about this. I want to find out about this. It really piqued my curiosity. And I wanted to be like Jackie Robinson, not as a player, because I didn't think that much at that time. When I eventually learned about Jackie Robinson, I knew I wasn't going to be Jackie Robinson. And no one else was going to be Jackie Robinson, by the way, either. But I couldn't run fast, and Jackie could certainly run fast. But he was a healer. What Jackie did, what impressed me in that film was he challenged the people that were saying mean things and hurting people's feelings, and he made it better. And he helped people whose feelings were hurt. And his feelings were hurt, but he was tough enough, strong enough, courageous enough, dedicated enough, an exceptional enough athlete to overcome. And that was what fascinated me about it. And that's what he became a hero for. Not that he could play baseball, that he could heal this terrible hurt that I felt, not to the extent that he felt or that African Americans felt, but it was still a pain, it was still a confusion to me. My mother was smart enough when I didn't get bar mitzvahed, mainly because I wanted to play baseball on Saturday when the religious school was, and all my friends were playing baseball, and I didn't want to take that much time out to go to religious school because I would miss too many games, which my mom let me get away with after the divorce. My dad didn't care, he was a secular Jew, he didn't go. After World War II, he said, I don't believe in God after all, that he was a secular Jew, he identified with Israel. My mother wanted me to have a Jewish education. My grandfather, Siegel, really wanted me to have one. When I got 15, she said, "You must be confirmed." And I fought it, but she forced me. One of the first things she ever forced me to do. And then I embraced it. All the other Jewish kids were just getting done with it. They couldn't wait to get done, and I discovered it. And one of my buddies in the confirmation class was a guy named Mike Vogel. Turned out to be first team All-City in football and baseball at Westchester High, where I would have gone had I not moved. Was second team All-American at Northridge, football fullback. I played baseball, I don't know if he was All-America, and then played some pro football. Another one of the non-Woody Allen-esque Jews who are athletes and strong and macho. And I love Woody Allen for his talent, not for his representation of the Jewish male, because some of us are not nebbish little wimps. No disrespect to Woody Allen, but we like to think of ourselves as very good athletes who competed, whose role models were Hank Greenberg, Sandy Koufax, Al Rosen, who was a boxer. And I had a chance to meet Al Rosen and Sandy Koufax and interview Sandy Koufax and spend some time with Al Rosen when he was out with Ted Williams in Iowa. The Jewish community needs to recognize there's a stream that runs from Hank and Al and Sandy through Mike Vogel, who was much better than me, but I was good enough to be on one of the best teams in the state, and lots of Jews are that good. Mike Safer at UCLA and his 3 sons who were professional athletes, without just naming a few. And that's my challenge to my own culture. When Snick said, "Go work in your own community," I got a lot of work to do in the Jewish community. Still, then and now. In fact, more now. So you asked though about my early years, but the early years were influenced by my family, by the divorce. Coming from a broken home, which Jackie Robinson also didn't have a father. I mean, there was a lot of things that I could identify with Jackie Robinson, and then I went up to UCLA, and the other big influence at that early part of my life was John Kennedy. He was so charismatic. He was good looking. Saw PT 109. He was a World War II hero. I mean, you couldn't have been much more heroic for me at that age than towing somebody through the water and these things. He was also very funny. He gave such a great speech. We're coming up to the anniversary in June, the night before Medgar Evers was killed, about the issue being as old as the scriptures and as current as our Constitution. Eisenhower was a grandfather figure to my generation. Kennedy was the new frontier. And also, of course, the ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That resonated. I was, had I not gone south, I would have been attracted towards the Peace Corps, but I went, Dr. King found me before the Peace Corps found me. But I was very, that was a great thing that for my generation in terms of idealism. So those were really, and then I was very primed. And then, of course, when I was 12, the Dodgers came out. They had 3 Jews on the team. They had Sandy Koufax, Norm Sherry, and Larry Sherry. And what a great deal. By 59, Sandy was just coming into his own, and Norm Sherry was the World Series MVP. Won 2 games, saved 2 games. So as a Jewish kid, that was thrilling. And I actually got to work out with the Dodgers 3 times when I was 13 and 14 at the Coliseum on the floor. Pete Reiser kind of adopted me, and Gil Hodges as well. I got to sit on the bench with him. So that was pretty neat. So I had a lot of great things in my childhood, and then Dr. King came to UCLA when I was 18 and asked for volunteers, announced the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Project, which was known as SCOPE, S-C-O-P-E project, and made the national announcement at UCLA. I'm quite sure because of Ralph Bunch and Jackie Robinson, each of whom had been on the front lines with him every year from 60 through 65, one or the other.
How aware of the civil rights movement or King were you before he came?
Actually,
this is 65?
Yeah, I'm going to name drop because Harris Wofford and I are good friends along with Andy Young. Those are my 2 big name friends among some, but wonderful men. And Harris was just in Birmingham with Alma Powell and Diane McWhirter, and he had mentioned, I said, well, maybe I'll be back in D.C. the anniversary of the March on Washington. He said, were you there? And I said, well, no, I wasn't yet 17. I was getting ready for high school football, and I had my own column in the Valley News and Green Sheet. I was the only kid that had his own column and covered B football. And then when I got to play varsity, they sent Herb Carlton, I remember the name, the photographer over with the orders, only take pictures of Willie Leventhal. And of course, he took 6 pictures, all of me, and one was in the paper the next day. So I was very happy. The little bit I got to play, at least I got in the paper. So we went to the city finals, which was on TV, and I was coaching third base instead of playing, which was extremely disappointing. But we were in the city finals, and that was, for those days, it was a big deal. There was no divisions. It was one tournament, one out of all of the city of LA, and 2 teams made it. And Birmingham beat us. We had beat them 5 times in a row, and they beat us. And my teammates never kind of forgave themselves for losing that game. But so those influences were going on, and I was, what I said about to Harris, I was aware of the March in Washington, but I was in California. I was 16. I was trying to get some playing time in football. I was little and not very big. I was in a new school. I'd just been there, 3/4 of my junior year, going into my senior year. But I knew what was going on. And also the 3 guys that were killed in Mississippi, 2 were Jewish that same summer, or the summer before, and the next summer when I was a senior, my senior summer, that had a big impact on me. The first time I really remember, as I told Harris, and the March in Washington, Jackie Robinson was far more the influence in my life than Martin Luther King. 20 months later, Dr. King came and wanted, asked for volunteers. But I remember very clearly being aware enough. Dr. King went into Selma January 1st at the request of many of the educators. Some of the SNCC people will say that they did all the work and Dr. King came and took the credit. But there was a group of educators and town leaders. And the way Andy and Jose tell about it, SNCC did great work in Selma, but they were beaten down. It was the repression was terrible. The violence was terrible. And unfortunately, the media didn't cover it enough, and the Justice Department didn't do enough, and they suffered a lot of losses they had in Mississippi. But the fact was, they were being beaten down, and we did need the media there. And those leaders in the town, and they're very easy to research and find. I'm trying to, Alma Boynton was certainly one of them, and there were some others in the school system, requested Dr. King and SCLC came in. And I remember the article in the paper, January 2nd. The reason I remember so well, I had a girlfriend up in Big Sur that I was trying to commute back and forth from UCLA, which was quite difficult. But her father was a Navy veteran. He was in the hospital. He had a drinking problem. And he was critical of Dr. King. And he was trying to tell me, well, in the service it didn't work, and the blacks, Negroes were this and that. And I said, you know what? This is about voting. I said, I don't care what you're talking about. This is a democracy. They're trying to register to vote. You're not going to persuade me that he's doing something wrong. So I had that conversation with my girlfriend's stepfather. And I mean, I had noticed it in the paper anyway. And I think I was, again, the killings in '64 and Freedom Summer. But that was my first time I can personally now remember knowing what Martin Luther King was doing. When he, it was the news when he went into Selma. And then I followed that. Of course, it was big news. And it was the Selma March, Bloody Sunday, was it? I think it was Bloody Sunday. There was Turnaround Tuesday, they call it Bloody Sunday. And little did I know that Jose Williams would become one of my dearest, closest friends. I would have, at this point, the only book about him. He's got a manuscript that he flew me down for to work on him, and we were, Willie, we're going to go to Savannah. We're going to go down to Attapogulas. Then we'd be in the office, and a poor person would come, and he'd interrupt our work and go counsel the poor person, and which is a wonderful thing about him, because he had the Poor People's Church of Love, Martin Luther King Poor People's Church of Love at the time. He had a storefront on Peachtree. Andy Young had an office on the 45th floor, almost across the street. But that manuscript is still sitting with his family that we were going to do. So my book is the only one. But he led that march on Bloody Sunday with John Lewis. And Dr. King came a month and a half later to UCLA. And had I not gone, I don't think I would have gone south. But Dr. King was so impressive that I was ready to go, but still afraid. And it took actually a friend to confront me, a Jewish friend I played football with at high school. And he was going, and he said, why don't you come? And I had no excuse except I'm scared, which I was. I was trying to be a counselor in a prison, but I'd gotten a thing saying you're too young. You can't be a counselor in a prison until you're 21. Because I had been interested in being a social worker at that time in my life. Just sort of what I did in my life anyway. So Dr. King made an appeal at UCLA, made the national announcement. And they had Joel Siegel was one of the key organizers, Rick Tuttle, another key organizer, even if he didn't want to talk about it in your interview. And he was actually our advisor. He was he was an old man of 25 at that time. We were all 18 and 19 and 20. And Rick was kind of our on-campus advisor. In fact, when I was arrested in Americus with John Lewis, and others of the UCLA group were with us. The pictures are in that book, Front Page News. I have the video from CBS and NBC and ABC, which Joel got me. Rick actually was connected enough politically at that time to get to Glenn Anderson, who was lieutenant governor for Pat Brown. Pat Brown was out of the state. And Glenn Anderson telegrammed Carl Sanders and said, we have 5 UCLA students missing in Americus. Because in those days, when you got arrested, like the guys in Mississippi, you didn't know whether you were going to go out in the country. In fact, my first arrest in Americus, I was the happiest civil rights worker when they turned towards the jail and not towards the country. That was my. I wasn't so worried about getting arrested. I was worried that I might not go to jail. And so Rick did that. There was at one point a telegram with my name and the others' names that Rick arranged. So Rick was very involved with Scope.
What were the charges in Americus?
Disturbing divine worship. I went 2 weeks. I went the first week, just me and John. Maybe there's some other people behind him, but me and John were in front. And the fire chief, it was actually quite an interesting experience, I've told many times. I went to Americas from Macon. Jose wanted people to go down to see a hot movement. And I think because of my athletic background and being little, I had to, they talk about giving 110%. When you're 5'8", 140 pounds, and most of the guys are 6 feet and bigger, if you look at my teams, I'm always one of the smaller ones. Although in high school it was kind of a small team, although we had, let's say half of us were small comparatively to the guys over 6 feet. You work harder. You have to work harder or you can't compete. And I wasn't as gifted. I was good enough to be with the most gifted in LA, but at the bottom of the group. And the only reason I was with the most gifted, and when I say most gifted, this is Steve Soggy, who played quarterback at USC, and then for the Dodgers, Tom Griffin, who was on my team, who played 12 years in the big league. Jeff Pentland, who's in the Hall of Fame at Arizona State, was Sammy Sosa's hitting coach, was the hitting coach for the Dodgers, now with Seattle. I mean, there's a difference. Those guys end up in the big leagues and in the Hall of Fame. Guys like me, if we work real hard, we can compete with them. And so I wasn't that gifted. I was good enough. I mean, some guys don't make the team. I made the team, so I was good enough to do that. But so I was at the bottom rung of the best in LA, which is good, so I could play when I integrated the Macon Bombers in that league in Macon.
We'll just pause every now and then to save the digital file, so it doesn't get too long.
So what we were talking about is the UCLA thing.
Yeah.
So Dr. King came. Are we back on?
Yeah.
So Dr. King came. Joel Siegel really was taking the lead, raised some money. Dr. King had a lunch at URC, University Religious Conference.
And for people who don't know, can you tell us who Joel Siegel is?
Joel Siegel at that time was the humor editor of the Daily Bruin and was in KELPS, which is a spirit organization. And as he said, I later became Joel Siegel on Good Morning America entertainment editor. And he did one piece in Israel as well. He did a little other journalism, but mainly he's known for entertainment and movie reviews, which he was very successful at, very well loved at. He came over to Queens College when I published this book. We did a program there. UCLA has never done a program for my book. Joel would have flown out for one, and they refused. Weren't interested for 6 years in doing even a plaque for Dr. King, and only did it because they were ordered to. Queens College embraced us. That's where Andy Goodman went to school. That's one that was killed with James Chaney and Mickey Schwerner. So Dr. King, I remember there were 2 things in a speech I'd be happy to tell you that really impressed me when I listened to it. I had, again, not yet decided I would volunteer, but wanted to and felt it was the right thing to do. You want to know the 2 things that impressed me? One thing, he talked about the 3 versions of love in Greek, agape, philia, and eros. As a teenager with hormones, I was very familiar with the eros, but the agape and philia were totally new concepts to me, and very interesting topics that you could divide love into other things, because at that point eros is pretty overwhelming when you're 18. The hormones are there. And of course I loved my family, and I had friends that were women that I didn't think of in sexual ways, but that was a pretty macho playboy time culture for young males in America. So that was very interesting to me, and also it was a way of understanding and putting into a theoretical context why I was interested and upset that people were being mistreated because they weren't showing agape or philia. And that was what supposedly America was about. Land of the free, home of the brave, out of many, one. What could be more philia and agape than that? So, and the other thing was, he had a great sense of humor, because Dr. King, about halfway through his speech, he was talking about the history, many of the good things that had happened, and he said, and I could stop here. He said, but first of all, Baptist preachers don't give short sermons. And then everybody laughed, of course. And he said, but I need to tell you the other part too, that there's a lot more work to do. and he was just a likable guy. He wasn't giving the kind of oration that he gave in the march. I mean, I have the tape that I got before. I think it's now restricted. I don't think you can get it from audiovisual UCLA, but before then I did get a copy, and actually I provided UCLA with the transcript that I paid for without any thanks. But he was a person, and of course Franklin Murphy introduced him, and he said, "This is, I think, when legend meets reality," and he said, "This is the moral leader of our country." Franklin Murphy was taking somewhat of a risk because the FBI was going around to every place that invited Dr. King and trying to sabotage it. I mean, because I wrote the report to President Reagan and the Congress on the first King holiday for Mrs. King, and I read all the congressional testimony. And since researching David Garrow's slimy, sleazy book, using Hoover's files, which Taylor Branch also does in, I think, a very disreputable way, have researched much of this from the 19 volumes that are at the UCLA Library of the House Assassinations Commission report, they start out that report by saying, "We hesitate to include many of these files, but so the reader has an understanding we are including them, but we are cautioning the reader that these represent a shameful chapter in American history, and these are unverified attributions towards people's personal lives and political affiliations," which is never found in Taylor Branch's book or David Garrow's book after they heavily quote those same files. They quote the same files that the Congress investigated with hundreds of thousands of dollars over many years, produced a report in 19 volumes, but and in my book, that's some of part of is in that book, went to Cass Canfield and Harper and Row, and he wanted it, but he wanted me to put sex things in, just as Holt Reinhardt and Winston did, just as many New York publishers want to sell books. I said no. Taylor Branch, David Garrow said yes. They won Pulitzer Prizes. I was on Tony Brown's Journal, and he said, this is after Garrow's book, he said, "Mr. Leventhal, you're challenging the Pulitzer Prize, and some people may say you're jealous of David Garrow because he won it and you didn't." I was a little caught off guard because Tony Brown and I had actually arranged, which he didn't want me to say on camera, but he had worked with me a little bit on the background of our interview. But it was still a challenge to go on national TV and be talking about Dr. King's personal life at all, because it's not something that's anybody's business, in my opinion. But I said, well, but I wasn't expecting that question. And I said, well, I would be dishonest if I said I wouldn't love to win a Pulitzer Prize for a book I did on Dr. King, but I would not want a Pulitzer Prize for that book. I would not want anything to do with that book. A Pulitzer Prize is not more important to me than telling the truth and not using these kinds of files. But anyway, that's a long answer to that visit by Dr. King. There was a committee set up. Joel, again, was very involved. Rick Tuttle, I'm sure Rick may have mentioned Alex White to you. I don't know if he did, but Alex White, who's not in good health now, ran the service organization at UCLA that sent people to internships. Alex was involved at the time. And I was just a freshman. And of course, my excuse to myself was when I was not going to do it because I was afraid, was that, I'm just a freshman. I kept thinking of reasons, they've got a lot of people, I'm sure. I'm just a freshman. They got better people than me. When the real wasn't, God, I want to go down there. They're going to kill me, just like they did the guys last summer. But when my friend confronted me, I just had that decision. And, that was my whole life up till then, hearing the kike words, Jackie Robinson, the March on Washington, some black friends I had. I did write what I told Harris Wofford. I did write an editorial. I wrote only sports from a high school paper, except 2 articles. One was about cigarette smoking because my mom had already had an operation for lung cancer, and she died 3 years later from lung cancer. And the stress of me being in the movement, I think, was not particularly good for her. So it's a very personal experience for me in that sense, that I put stress on my family by making the decision to get involved and stay involved. My dad was very happy that I went. He wasn't so happy I stayed involved after I came back, after 3 arrests and so on. Because he said, "You've done your part. You served your tour. You don't have to keep doing this." And I said, "Well, they've asked me to be the college coordinator." So I was very involved. I think it was a very religious thing for me as well. I think I found a real religious connection to my Judaism, and the Judaism was a big connection to the explanation of how to respond to anti-Semitism.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about that for a second? Because I often feel that people's civil rights experiences are very much like a conversion experience. what they experience there and how they relate to it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I wanted to finish. There was one other. What was I? Well, I'll eventually wander back to it later. But well, not so much of a conversion that there's a letter in that book that it was a letter I wrote to my then roommate Charlie Goldberg, who he took it to the Daily Broom and they published it. And I've actually heard it from some of the other people that were in the Scope project. I had not been around a lot of black people. Only two were in my high school. I played baseball and football against the kids from San Fernando and Pacoima, were Mexican and black at that time. And so I didn't have a lot of personal experience. The editorial in the high school paper, I do want to talk about that first. That came about because Grant at that time was a very TV, Hollywood kind of place. Tom Selleck went there, a good basketball player, track guy. James Keach, who's a good friend of mine, lives up the road here. I was married to Jane Seymour, Dr. Quinn. James did a great movie about Johnny Cash and the Long Riders with his brother Stacy. Many other Hollywood people, one of whom was a guy named Kim Weiskopf, whose dad wrote I Love Lucy. Kim, being well-to-do, went to a Beverly Hills camp. One of the counselors was a black guy who went to Cal State LA, was All-American football player at Cal State when they still had a football team. I went to a party that summer, my junior summer with Kim, and this African-American, in those days would have said Negro guy, was there. Nicest guy in the world, great singer. He sang at the party. I met him, nicest guy in the world. Then Proposition 14 was on the ballot in '64, which was the anti-discrimination housing thing, which lost, by the way, in the Rumford Act, which got then declared, I believe, unconstitutional. The other editorial besides smoking was about this African-American young man who I named at the time. I don't remember his name anymore. It's still in the Grand Odyssey files. And I said I was with my friend Kim Weiskopf, who was the photographer for the paper. Later went in and wrote Good Times and created Full House, 9 to 5, married with children. Died recently, not too long, of cancer, sadly, but had a great career in Hollywood. Followed his father. Norman Lear got him his first job. Nice when your father's friends with Norman Lear. But Kim took me to the party, and I said I was at a party with Kim. I met this guy. He's a great guy. He's an All-American football player. He's a great student. He sings great. I said, but some people wouldn't want him for a neighbor because he's Negro. And I was mature enough at 17 to say, I think it was one of the better things I've ever written. And I told Harris, I said, I think, I was with the March on Washington in spirit. If not, I was mature enough to write that article based on my friendship with him. But the conversion, to go back to your question, was when we then went to the South, there was an immersion into the black community. So those of us who wanted to feel we looked at everybody the same, you can't look at everybody the same if you're only around white people, because black people look different, not better, worse. Just the same thing I would say with gay people. It's not better, worse, it's different. I don't know why we can't just say people can be different, and that's okay. That doesn't mean we don't like them, doesn't mean we're homophobic. We just say, hey, a marriage between a man and a woman and a woman is different. It doesn't have to be the same. I've always felt, pick a new word. Say it's my loved one. This is my loved one. I think we should change it all. Men and women should say this is my loved one. Take the word marriage away, because that offends older conservative people who don't hate people, but hate that they're losing what they consider as very sacred for generations in history and blah, 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 what they said at the Supreme Court. Thought the discussion was pretty good. I think we should get away from marriage and let everybody talk about their loved one. And some people's loved ones are their children, like Dr. King, agape, philia, eros. You can have eros with a man, eros with a woman. I don't care. But I hate to see all this division and pain about this subject. As somebody with this background, and people have just suggested that, get the state out of it. But I think we should have a new word for it. Not marriage, my loved one. My loved one. And just say some things are different. And again, it's different when you're not around black people. The great story is, and other people that I've now, Sherry Labitas, who's written a new book, another woman who's writing a book, Maria Gittin, University of Alabama, about scope workers. After my effort to organize our first, SNCC has a reunion every year, multiple ones, every 10 years, 50 years. The Attorney General comes to their reunion. I had one reunion. We've only in Scope had one ever. There was a professor from Albany, New York, who did his group in South Carolina. Andy Young came because it was in Atlanta, and Andy's my friend, and he's so nice to have come, and that's why I got an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Fox News was going to come, but we quit a little too early. But a number of us have said it was so different when we immersed in the black community, and within a few weeks, black people just looked normal. They weren't different anymore because we saw them every day. And then they didn't all look the same either because they're all different shades. They have different lips, different noses, different, just like white people. We're all different, but with the skin color, it's different hues. And in fact, the great story, there's a young man, not anymore, but at the time, who worked from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, forgetting the college, not Davidson, I can't think of the name, but anyway, he had the same experience I did. And he said when he knew it was time to go, he stayed extra like I did. He said he stayed till November. And he said his mother called him and he thought, why is this white woman calling me? And he said, that's wrong. He said, I knew I needed a break at that time. And I know for me, the way I describe it is, in the beginning, the black people looked different. By the end of the summer, the white people looked different. I didn't think I was black, but black people were my friends. Black people were my baseball teammates. Some of the white people literally wanted to kill me and did try and kill me. So the white people looked different to me. And just within 3 months, it shows how my background is sociology, shows how acculturation. So one of the conversions is that emotionally, and I said in that letter, I used to want and used to believe I wasn't prejudiced and saw everybody the same. But now I really feel that way because I know black people. I know more black people than I used to in those days, Negroes. And so that's one part of the conversion, is that when you have so many black friends and you're living with a black family, that becomes your life. And you have no more doubts that you're going to treat people different because they're black, because everybody's black that you knew. So they become, and then the young, beautiful black women become young, beautiful women, and the good athletes become good athletes, and the color fades to very little significance at that point.
So let me just ask you where you went, if you could just tell the
Yeah,
experience.
so the way the Scope project was organized, the board of SCLC at Hosea Williams' request, and he developed the project, which is in my book, Scope of Freedom, the founding papers essentially, approved it in December, and they targeted 120 counties. They didn't target, and it was much like a battle plan. Hosea Williams was a World War II veteran, was in General George Patton's, what they called the Negro Tank Brigade. A great friend of mine, Jim Coliani, who was a Catholic lay leader, who was at that time executive editor of Ramparts with Jan Wenner. In fact, Jan Wenner tried to convince him to go partners with this new magazine that he was going to start. I think it was called Rolling Stone, but Jan was only like 21, and Jim said, yeah, Jan, that's really cool, but we grown-ups are doing other stuff, and so he didn't found Rolling Stone with Jan Wenner. But Jan worked at Ramparts as a young kid. So, but Jim started a business and did sermons, which I think his son is still doing. I think Jim's still alive in New Jersey. It must be in his 80s. He was also a World War II veteran. I dated his daughter very briefly, Karen Coliani Johnson, who's in LA, who I met through somebody in the McGovern campaign, yada, 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 all these connections through politics and civil rights. And the reason I bring up Jim is he did an issue of Ramparts about Selma, and he did it in a military way where he had a joint chiefs of staff almost on the white side, Jim Clark, the black side, Dr. King, but he did it as a military battle. And that was very apropos and very brilliant. That's the spring issue of Ramparts magazine somewhere in the library. But Jose really had kind of a battle plan, and they picked 120 counties, which are listed in the book. These were not the worst 120 counties. These were the 120 counties where if they got another 30 or 40% Negro voters, they could knock out the racists and get in a moderate. Some of the counties, like Lowndes County, there was no blacks at all. I mean, you had a longer road. That's why the Black Panther Party was appropriate in many, many ways, and it was a very good thing in Mississippi in many places, because you had to move outside the party. Dr. King and Scope and Andy Young, and they wanted to move within the Democratic Party and overturn the worst racist counties. And Andy Young has told me that those same 120 Scope counties all went for Barack Obama and may have made the difference in the election 2008. You can talk to Andy about that, I haven't seen those statistics. In his his governor's campaign in Georgia, the Scope counties in South Georgia also, again, were counties that came out heavily for him. And many of those are also where Scope and SNCC work together. But they wanted 2,000 volunteers to man these 120 counties. They only got 500. So when people tell you, well, it was all over, and nothing going on, more people got killed in the year of 65 as civil rights workers than in 64. It was still quite dangerous. I'm sure Cheryl Sherrod will verify that, and other people from Southwest Georgia. And also at that point, whites were getting killed because blacks were starting to shoot back. That happened in Americus. Unfortunately, a bystander who was white, Andrew Watley, who I consider a martyr of the movement, who had just joined the Marines, was a bystander when they were throwing rocks at the marchers. And there was a black car, a car came with two black guys. They weren't part of the movement, and they were tired of people being abused, and they shot back. I got shot at twice in Americus. We didn't get to shoot back. That wasn't part of our thing, but there are many SNCC people that were carrying guns by then. But not, in fact, I tell the story in my article, I think you saw for B'nai B'rith magazine, Judson Ford, a Korean war vet, stuck a .38 in his belt when we were going out to get kids. We're not in a demonstration now. There was a transition period going through Deacons for Defense and Justice in Louisiana. We're already openly carrying guns. But within the movement, within Dr. King, during demonstrations, etc., that was our philosophy, and that was the philosophy of Scope. So,
did you go through specific training?
Yeah. But you asked to where I was. Absolutely, the orientation schedule, which is in there, was fascinating. But because we only could get 500, because of the danger, that's why people didn't volunteer. And it was almost all white, and not this. There were many blacks in the South. Not too many blacks were coming out of the North to go south. Stoney Cooks was one. And I hope you get a chance to talk to Stoney in Washington. And Stoney could tell you about that. But Jesse Jackson was another who came into Selma at that time. That was when he got involved with SCLC in Selma. Not in the leadership role, by the way, that came later. But Stoney did have a leadership role very quickly. The people with skills immediately, there's a lady named Kit Clark, who I just saw about with Scope, whose papers are now at the Schomburg. Mm-hmm. She had some skills. She went to the leadership role in Scope with Jose. Jose was good at picking people. He picked me, so I don't know, hopefully that was a good pick also. But so we couldn't man the whole 120 counties. We went essentially into 90 counties. They had black leaders in all the 20 counties that had requested people. They were working, and some of us were shifted around. I worked in 2 counties primarily, but went into 4 or 5 other counties for demonstrations. So they sent out recruiting teams between Selma, between the first of the year while Selma was going on. They had recruiting teams all around the country at colleges. And Dr. King himself was the recruiter at UCLA. So I always got to tell people, Dr. King recruited me, not Jose, not Andy. I said, Dr. King recruited me, so I don't have to answer to you guys so much as you might want me to. And I think he also knew that I had been picked because I had talked to him personally, got to thank him when he called us in for a meeting. But so we went to Atlanta. We were housed at Morris Brown College in the dorms. I recently said I may have learned more in 1 week at Morris Brown than in 6 years with a BA and MA at UCLA. Particularly now the way I feel about UCLA and what they've done with the Scope history and taking down Dr. King's photo and Franklin Murphy's photo from that wonderful day when Dr. King back to honor, by the way, Jackie Robinson and Ralph Bunch, who the UCLA people love to make money on and market, particularly Jackie Robinson. And Rachel Robinson does not know this, but I hope to tell her before too long. I just missed her at the Civil Rights game. Sat across from her with Andy, and then went out to give her the little thing, and she left early. But I'll see Mrs. Robinson at some point. Andy knows, but there's only so many battles you fight at a time. This is my battle. I got the plaque up anyway, but for his visit. But so we had this wonderful orientation. If you hand me the book, or I'll tell you who was there at the orientation. It's amazing, amazing. I consider it the best week of education in American history. That's a big statement. Let me tell you who was there. Dr. King spoke to us. Bayard Rustin organized and ran it. Mm-hmm. Jose spoke to us and was one of the organizers. Norman Hill, who had been at CORE, was Bayard's assistant. Then we had people like C. Van Woodward, John Hope Franklin from academia. Lillian Smith was there, didn't speak. We also had Septima Clark, who started the Citizenship Education Schools. We had Vernon Jordan. We had Charles Morgan. With the legal organization, ACLU, national leader. We had Clarence Mitchell from the NAACP, the head of their office there. We had the field staff who oriented us. We had Michael Harrington, who had just written The Other America, which was a key book about poverty. We had a number of government people. We had a Jewish man who was head of the Meat Packers Union, whose picture is in there. Why am I forgetting his name? He was there. John Doerr came down. He's not on the schedule, but he came down and told us how to make reports to him, which Joel Siegel did when my life was threatened, in Macon, which resulted in 33 gas stations getting desegregated in 3 states, because John Doerr had trained us, and John Doerr ordered J. Edgar Hoover to investigate. And once that happened, the FBI did a very good investigation, which is recorded in my FBI file that's in the book. So it was an extraordinary week. I've forgotten a few people, but just the people I mentioned to you, it's a pretty all-star cast of people to speak to us in a week. And Dr. King addressed us. And the amazing thing about Dr. King's speech, when he closed with "Free at last, free at last," he said, Protestants, like in March on Washington, he said, Jews and Gentiles, Protestant, black and white Protestant Catholics, Jews and Gentiles. When he spoke to us, knowing that there were young people, some who might be atheists or agnostic, he said Muslims and Hindus and non-believers. Now because he had been to India, he knew about Pakistan, India, the Muslim and the Hindus fighting there, and he knew about Kashmir, and I've talked to Kashmir. Andy Young has been to Kashmir. He was happy that I even knew about Kashmir because I'm not a global person. But to me, given our world now with the things that are going on in the world, in the Islamic world, and still with Pakistan and India, that Dr. King went out of his way to say that. And that recording is available, by the way. That was at Morris Brown College at Joe Louis Gymnasium. Such a far-reaching, visionary thing to talk about to a college group. And now as we look at it, he was talking about we need to heal these divisions of race and religion, and not just among Jews and Gentiles, among Hindus and Muslims. Although in those days I don't know how, those days it was Muslim, but then we've changed it to Muslim, but he said Muslim and Hindu. And I know the reason he said it was because of Gandhi in India and Pakistan. So it was an amazing week. We were all energized. Originally, as with a number of chapters, the gentleman, Larry Scott Butler, is the one who talked about his mom. And he had a lot of similar experience. He went off to Bogalusa, and the man at the house where he stayed had a gun, same thing, and said, "My daughter's here." Because Larry Scott Butler said the same thing. Wait, we're nonviolent. He said, "We might be. Nobody's going to kill my daughter." You know. And what Andy Young always said, he said, if it had not been for nonviolence, the South would have been like Northern Ireland. He said, because everybody in the South, in rural areas, they all hunt, and most of the people had been in World War II, and everybody had guns.
Or Korea, yeah.
Yeah, from Korea and World War II. It wasn't that long after 15 years after World War II, or 20 years after World War II. So if you look at it that way, both SNCC and NSCLC through nonviolence, you could say they saved the country, because if we had been like Northern Ireland at that point in our history with Africa becoming independent, I always tell people this was about America. What one of the Swedish guys who was at the co-op, I ran on the all-U cross-country championship team for intramurals, and it was me, a guy who was a very good runner, and a guy from Sweden. And he told me, he said, when my mother talked about when in Europe, when they saw headlines about Alabama, it wasn't about Alabama, it was about America. And when Russia was saying, follow us, independent countries, we're the great country, we're socialism, everybody's taken care of. And we said, no, follow us, we're about freedom. And yet we weren't about freedom to a significant number. It was the double V. We have, it's a great, and that's why when I'm in Montgomery, I try to tell the whites and the blacks, and many of the whites, they just overwhelmingly, in the Senate and the House, passed resolutions in Alabama to pardon the Scottsboro boys, without one dissenting vote, not one. And the governor's going to sign it. And they've now recognized and embraced this was for everybody. This movement, and many of the whites say it freed us from our guilt, and it freed us from the terrorism of the Klan, And there were many whites who stood up, Clifford and Virginia Durr, and who I write about in here, Aubrey Williams, wonderful people, who they really had some courage, because they lived there the whole time. We left, because we weren't living there. Some of us stayed a little longer, whatever. I'm one of the few that's moved there. And I like Alabama now. And Alabama's changed a great deal, great deal. And I'll try and be shorter to respond to your questions. Well, let me mention one other person in Alabama is Millard Fuller from Lynette and his wife Linda from Montgomery, who started Habitat, who I met. I wrote the first article about Millard and housing because that started at Koinonia Farm, Sunshine Acres. That's where it started. And I actually did my R&R out of Americus over at Koinonia for a couple of days. So we got out of jail, they took us out there. I met Clarence Jordan, who was the father, the founder of that place, and I became very close friends with Florence. By the way, the uncle of Hamilton. 5 Jordan brothers, 1 integrationist, that was Clarence, and who knew Hamilton Jordan quite well, and Hamilton knew his uncle Clarence quite well.
Yeah, Koinonia was really, as you say, an R&R place for the movement.
Well, it was its own place too. I mean, they had their own history, but did they do that in Albany too? They went up to Koinonia?
Yeah.
Did they?
Yeah.
Well, I got to swim in a water hole. Something that a boy from California, 2 big country things I had in the South. One was the water hole at Koinonia. The other was my first baseball game with the Macon Bombers in Round Oak, Georgia, which was in the middle of a cow pasture that trees had been cut down, and there were cow patties on the baseball field. This was not something that a boy from LA who played on pretty good baseball fields was used to, because my mind said, well, what if the ball hits the cow patty? Country boys don't care about that stuff.
Play on.
Yeah, and fortunately the ball didn't hit the cow patties. But
well, that's a good segue to, so would take us past the orientation into your assignment.
Yeah, so we had the orientation. It was an incredible orientation. And the same thing with Larry Butler, the reason I say, originally they got assigned one place. We got assigned to Macon County, which was small, but we had one of the biggest groups. We had 20. Brandeis had a big group, which they don't seem to be interested in, or my Jewish brethren don't seem to be interested. That small college had as big as Columbia, UCLA, Berkeley. I'm working on that, and that they will get interested, I guarantee you, in the next couple of years, or they will be very embarrassed. Maybe this may embarrass them. But Jonathan Sarna, who's the guy who spoke at the B'nai B'rith Convention, who's the advisor to the National Jewish Museum, is there. I gave him the book. He hasn't called me back yet. I will deal with Dr. Sarna, who's a very important, distinguished, and of course Willie Leventhal is not. He dropped out before he got his PhD at UCLA, but this is my mission, and you're giving me a little forum for it, so I appreciate that. But
so they sent all the UCLA people together?
Yeah, that was the reason. And they also wanted to assign us where they could get some numbers, which was Macon, Georgia, where they had a great local leader, number of great local leaders. Bill Randall, William P. Randall was one. They had a man named Tom Jackson, who became the first black judge, who was the only black lawyer in town. There weren't many in Georgia at that time. And he went south, he returned south, and he became a good, he was also a former semi-pro baseball player. And of course his family and his wife's family thought they were completely crazy to go south. But he knew Mr. Randall, and he went back, and he's a courageous guy. And there was also a guy named Lewis Wynn, many others. There was the NAACP Youth Council, but Mr. Randall was the town leader. He was a great guy. Joel Siegel talked about him on Good Morning America. He was somewhat of a mentor to Joel, although Joel never went back either. A lot of people, once they left, they didn't want to go back for whatever reasons. I did, because I became friends with Jose and Andy and Mr. Randall. And Joel went back and did a great piece for Good Morning America that I was kind of the field producer of. But so, my position was the SCLC. We're on assignment from them. That's where Jose wants. That's where we went. It wasn't a great discussion, but there was some romanticism, and also maybe we're needed more in the rural areas. But that soon ended when Jose said, "You are ordered to go to America. I am the general. You are the troops. You go where I tell you. That's the way it works here." And that's what we did. There was no discussion that they had a snick that whites were taking control. Jose made it very clear who was in charge. Willie Bolden, who was an ex-Marine and a very tough guy. There was no cognitive dissonance about who was going to be running anything. SCLC ran it, Jose ran it, and his troops ran it. And we learned, and if we did well, we got asked to join the staff, and then we had a little more stature on the staff. But there was no confusion in our group. Jose ran it. We didn't have that problem. And Mr. Randall ran it. And there was anyway, so that was one thing. Larry Scott Butler's group was a great story, was that, I got to tell this story. And Larry Scott is down in Florida. They got assigned to some county, and then SCLC said no. Jose said, "We need you," or the guy that was Jose's guy there, I think his Minister Harrell, I think his name, Reverend Harrell, said, "No, we need you to go to Clayton, Alabama, Barber County, Alabama." They said, but we already talked to these people here. We need, they were expecting us. They said, "Barber County is the home of George Wallace. We need you to go raise hell in George Wallace." And they immediately said, "When do we leave?" And they had big demonstrations. They tore that town up. And apparently George Wallace came down one time. And his comment was, he sat at the auto repair place, watched them march to the courthouse. And he said, that's the best looking, best dressed group of civil rights worker I've ever seen. Because we were told, and one of the reasons SNCC didn't like us, because we were told not to have beards, told to look more preppy, and to be careful about holding interracial couples in public, because it's not a criticism of SNCC. They were courageous, wonderful people, but they made the white people even angrier because they flaunted it sometimes. Not that it didn't need to be flaunted in some sense, but it also could get people hurt and killed and so on. And not that that wasn't of value. That was one of our roles. If we got killed, that brought the media, and that changed things. That's a sad thing to say, but black people's lives weren't too important in those days. So, so we were told to dress well. Well, George Wallace noticed. He said, that's the best dressed group of civil rights workers I ever saw. Apparently, I mean, that's what Larry Scott Butler told me. That was his only comment, which I think is hilarious. But they registered a lot of people. That was one of the second most active movements in scope. America's was probably the first, and they're all in the incidents reports in that book. There's about 20 pages of incident reports. Not everything made the incidents reports. What's that?
Hold up the book and explain.
Be happy to. The Scope of Freedom, the leadership of Jose Williams with Dr. King, Summer 65 student volunteers. There's Jose and Andy in St. Augustine, where Jackie Robinson, by the way, was. As long Jackie Robinson was in Birmingham, Jackie Robinson was in Albany, as they call it. Did Charles Sherrod, because I know did he talk about Jackie Robinson? Jackie went there at Dr. King's request after the churches were burned, and they couldn't get the media. I have an interview with Andy Young in the book you have about that, but I have this great photo of Jackie Robinson with Wyatt T. Walker in Albany near a burned out church. And Andy said in the interview, he said, if you want to talk about being in harm's way, being in rural southwest Georgia after the churches have been burned out by the Klan, that's as much harm's way as you can be in those days, because you're not in a demonstration. They had the media there, but there's Jackie. Didn't have to be there. He's from Cairo, not too far from there. But he was on the front lines over and over again. One of the reasons he's even more my hero now, that I think that I know more about him than when I was young. But he was a healer, and God bless him. God bless him. I'm glad he's getting the recognition. God bless Bud Selig. I got to meet Bud through Andy. That's one reason Bud would want to meet me, really. Not that he just because he has too many other things to do. He's a nice man. He's done a great job retiring Jackie's number. Harrison Ford did a great job with this movie, and young people of all races need to know, here's a celebrity. He wasn't worried about the bling. He wasn't worried about tweeting. He didn't have his own reality show, although he did play himself in a wonderful movie, Jackie Robinson story. Typical of that era of Hollywood, well-meaning but a little hokey at places. But still a good movie, and you get to see Jackie himself and Ruby Dee, who's Rachel Robinson is a wonderfully attractive woman, as is Ruby Dee, playing Jackie Robinson's wife. But such a special guy, such a lesson and these young ball players are now learning it. I've just read the MLB blog, and Bryce Harper saw the movie at the White House. Barack Obama showed 42, and Bryce Harper was enthused, and Matt Kemp, and it's baseball has a special role in all this because of Jackie and Branch Rickey. And as Jackie said in his book, I Never Had It Made, this was Branch Rickey's deal. I was just an actor in Branch Rickey's deal. I mean, Branch Rickey conceived it all.
So can you tell us about the role that baseball played for you that summer? Okay.
Oh, sure. Talking about baseball, I love it. And that's actually an interesting story, which is hopefully will be on the big screen or small screen at some point. But it's ironic, that was going to be my first summer not playing baseball since I was 10 years old. I had been discouraged. My high school team went to the city finals, and I had played I played American Legion as a 15-year-old in South Bay, where I had been the all-area shortstop. I played. You had to get asked to be on that team after high school, and my teammates and their family, their two dads, both who played professional baseball, the kids, Jeff Pentland and Ron McMacken, who's a buddy of Mark McGuire, golfs with Mark McGuire and Tiger Woods. Very successful bunch of guys and great athletes. Their dads, and they called my parents to meetings. We want Willie to play on the American Legion team, and it was a very fast group. They had come in third in the state in Little League. They're very good. But that summer I didn't play with them. They asked me to play, and I was getting ready for school, and I was kind of burned out because I got hurt both years. and didn't get much playing time. Now I really regret it. They went to the state finals in Yountville in American Legion, and went on to great things in baseball. 5 pros on the high school team and 2 more that turned down contracts, which is very rare. That's like a Division I, 11 Division I athletes on my high school baseball team, 2 in the big leagues. So I had played with good guys. I had been around good baseball players, not realizing at the time how good they were, because I was more discouraged because I wasn't playing. And in fact, my high school coach told me, I said, I'm going to UCLA. Do you think I can play there? He said, oh yeah, you couldn't play at USC, but you can play at UCLA. I'm thinking, what the hell are you talking about? I'm not playing here. But as a matter of fact, our high school team was better than UCLA. By the time my friends were in college, they were in the Hall of Fame at Santa Barbara, Arizona State. They beat UCLA every time they played them. The pitchers were our strong suit. Our 4th pitcher pitched AA baseball. So I played good baseball. I wasn't going to play that summer. When I came back, I got asked actually to go out at UCLA by a guy named Ray Arrington, who's in the Hall of Fame, because he heard about that I played in the South, because it was in my letter. But there was a guy named Willie Bowens, who still works at the VA. He came back with us. He was the one that was not invited to the opening of the Martin Luther King Memorial, along with everybody else. And I tried to tell, they had the names. Rick Tuttle and I developed the list. And he was an African-American who worked 3 miles away. He didn't get invited. I wouldn't go. They finally invited me, but I said, if you don't invite everybody, I'm not going. I didn't care that much about having my little day of glory among the UCLA group that had been opposed to having a plaque for Dr. King for 6 years. Only did it because they were forced to by the NAACP and the president of the university, Mark Edoff, who hasn't forced them to put the picture back up yet. So Willie Bowens was one of our young recruits. Some had worked with the NAACP Youth Council. Others came into the movement that summer because William P. Randall took us around to a different church every night the first week. We had a mass meeting, you know what mass meetings are. And he introduced us. He said, these white people have come down here. These white students here from UCLA. Dr. King did this. Jose Williams did this. And William P. Randall was a special, wonderful man. Later there's a building named for him, as Joel Siegel said on Good Morning America. He later became a Bibb County Commissioner. His son was the first state representative. His granddaughter is now the state representative, and his son is a judge. So things do change and have changed. But Bill was the leader in the town. Wonderful, just a neat man. And so we started recruiting young people from all the different parts of town. And Willie Bowens came out of East Macon, which is where I ended up living with the Simmons family. Terrell Simmons was on the Macon Bombers as well, but I didn't know that at the time. He was gone. There was no father in home. That was a little bit of a scandal I later found because Mrs. Simmons took in 2 white boys and she had 2 daughters still at home. One was at Tuskegee already. He's now in Mali, and things are not going well in Mali. So Lucille, I'm in touch with her by email occasionally, not recently. I should find out what's going on with her, but she usually lets me know if there's a problem. But anyway, so Terrell was on the team. But Willie Bowens and I became good buddies. Also, William C. Randall, who was Mr. Randall's nephew, who later had a terrible car accident. But William C. and Willie and I, and of course said one thing I really liked is there were lots of Willies. Oh, there was one time I was in a front yard and it was me and Willie Bowens, and the guy we were trying to get to register, his name was Willie, and the cousin's name was Willie. And I wrote in the thing, I said, lots of Willies. I said, one thing us Willies feel is that all people are created equal except Willies. We're created more equal. Because I was thinking of Willie Mays because he was such a great athlete. But anyway, so Willie and I got to be buddies. Willie Bowens was on the Macon Bombers, and he said, hey, maybe I can get you a tryout. I used to wear my football jersey. It's in the picture here from the scope book. I was stupid enough to actually wear it in the marches. And which I think now, there was a great target for the Klan. I was like one of the only white guys, and I'm wearing a bullseye. But I was doing it to relate to the guys through athletics, which was my strong suit. So they used to call me number 10 a little bit later on in Macon because I wore my football jersey, and I was proud I'd been on the football team. So
and who were the Bombers?
The Bombers were in Macon. Sometimes they're called the Bibb Bombers as well. Yeah. There's an article in, I think, that book I showed you with Terrell's picture and me. Terrell and I did this program at the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame on the Macon Bombers because they had a traveling exhibit on baseball in black and white about the Negro Leagues. And they also had, of course, they had the Negro Leagues, and they had a lot of local Negro leagues because there was no, they couldn't have black-white leagues, so they had their own leagues. So Willie got me a tryout, and so we went out. Terrell had the team bus, Terrell always worked 2 or 3 jobs. Terrell sadly had a heart attack about 5 years ago now, passed away, but I would always stay with Terrell. two people I would always see in Atlanta first were Terrell and Jose. And I would usually stay on Terrell's couch. When I wrote the report to the President of the Congress, I stayed on Terrell's couch for 3 months working for Mrs. King. And I gave some money. I gave $400 back to the Holiday Commission, which didn't have public funding, partly because Terrell gave me free rent. So I had a little extra and they didn't have much money. Lloyd Davis, who was my supervisor there, who was a federal bureaucrat, wonderful man, worked for Sergeant Shriver, worked the Republican side when they passed the King Holiday and Reagan signed it. And his eyes got very big. You're giving me money back? It's like, nobody gives money back. This is the federal government. But we didn't have federal money yet. We did later get it. And had it been federal money, I wouldn't have given it back. But we didn't have much money, and it was private money. And I just never wanted people to think that I was doing it for the money. I may have overdone that because I ended up quite impoverished many times. That's one of the reasons I was on Terrell's couch. But anyway, so Terrell had a bread truck. He had a full-time job and a bread route. So his bread truck was a team bus on the weekends. So they came by 795 Center Street in East Macon, where the Simmons family lived. MMA Simmons was a professional cook, so I got real good food that summer. We got in the truck, and I think they may have told me we're playing in Round Oak. I didn't know where Round Oak was. Go off out about 40 miles away and go through this little town, which is still there. There's like a post office with some boxes and a general store. That's Round Oak, Georgia. That's it. And then you got country. And so we get to this place, and it's a cow pasture with the trees cut down and a diamond cut in there. That's the field. And then, you know, the first thing I'm noticing is the cow patties, and I'm going, okay. And so because of what I was doing, unlike Jackie Robinson, as I've said a couple times in articles, everybody was very nice to me. They didn't know if I could play or not, but they were going to give me a chance. One guy that wasn't too happy was the guy that was shortstop before I got there because he got bumped through no fault of his own. But I had just come out of this experience moving to this place where I got bumped, and I didn't want to give up any playing time. I look back at now, and I think I played every inning, but my best, I don't know, maybe he did get to play a little bit. I think I played every inning once I got there. But he knew I was only going to be there for a while. But everybody else was real friendly. He would sit in the dugout. He would look at me. He didn't say anything, but he wasn't happy, and I got it. I knew it. You know, and I felt bad for him, but not that bad that I was going to coach, let him play. No, I loved playing baseball, and I loved practicing, but I loved playing in the game. I loved the competition. So this was my chance to play. I barely got to play. I got injured both years of high school. I played a lot in American Legion my junior year, but I didn't. I kept getting hurt, and I kept running into Tommy Griffin, who got drafted number 4 in the country and was Rookie Pitcher of the Year when he was 20 years old, struck out 200 for Houston, who was also a good enough hitter that he pinch hit. He was 6'4". I wasn't going to beat Tommy Griffin out. That just wasn't going to happen. And I mean, I'd forgotten he was drafted first round, number 4 in the country. That's who I had to beat out. So I got to play. And as I said in the article, the first ball hit to me, I think it was maybe first or second inning, bopped out of my glove. But I made a quick recovery. I had a quick release, threw it, and I'm pretty sure it was a tie. A tie goes to the runner. Umpire called him out. He gave me the call. And I think they sensed, you know, here's this new kid. He's out here by himself. He's working with Dr. King. We're gonna and as the guy that wrote the nice article for the LA Weekly, he said that was sort of a welcome. But I got the call. That should have been E. Leventhal. It should have been E6. It was close, but it was a tie. A tie goes to the runner. I got the call, and of course that boosted my confidence. Instead of having an error your first play, you made the play. Because that happens in baseball. Sometimes, I mean, I don't know if the umpire did it on purpose. I think he did it on purpose. Because I was the white kid and they were being nice to me because they knew I was there. At bat, it was very interesting because we didn't have any batting practice and I had not played in a year. And I was an okay hitter, although I've since Jeff Pentland, who later was Sammy Sosa's coach and the Dodgers coach and about 6 teams, he's since showed me how to hit. But in those days, swing level, keep your eye on the ball, don't step in the bucket. So, you know, it was whatever natural ability you had, and I had some. But I told Jeff, I said, Jeff, why didn't you tell me this when we were in high school? He said, I didn't know when we were in high school. I said, you knew you were doing it because he was so good a hitter. He was such a great hitter. But he learned the mechanics of it, and that's what in Major League Baseball, the hitting coaches, it's a science. It's a science. That's why they have videotapes and they correct a little hitch and this and that. So I was just winging it, and I was competitive, and I had a bunch. Out of my stats, which are in there, I was on base 11 out of 15 times, which is very, very good on base average. But there were 10 walks, once into the head, but with a curveball. I wasn't dusted off like Jackie. It was a curveball and Warner Robins, and it just hit my helmet. We wore helmets by then. Back in the old days, they didn't. and then a sacrifice fly, and I drove in a run to tie a game. And they were very happy that I made that contact. But the walks, which are very odd, how can somebody get and then I struck out 3 times. But I beat the pitcher in the sense 11 out of 14 times versus walks versus strikeouts. And most of those at bats, if you know what a 9 or 10 pitch at bat is in baseball, 3-2 is 5 pitches. And then if you keep fouling off pitches, Matt Kemp just did this against a good pitcher. He had 11 pitch at bat. The pitcher, opening day, then the giant pitcher had to go out, Lincecum, I think, and he wore him out. My timing was off, and I'd never done that before in my life, but I kept hitting foul ball after foul ball after foul ball after foul ball, and then I got a walk. And that happened, I'd say of those 11 walks, about 9 were probably more than 8 or 9 were 8 or 9, 11, somewhere. There probably one, I think one at bat I must have had 10 foul balls. But I wanted to do well so well. My coordination wasn't good enough. My timing wasn't because I hadn't had any batting practice. I never got any batting practice because they practiced during the week. I had to do voter registration during the week. They didn't practice on batting practice on Sunday before the game, so I just had to go out and play. And but I didn't want to strike out, so I could get enough of the ball. And then finally, my last game in Milledgeville, which is now famous for the quarterback had the terrible incident there in Milledgeville in the bar, very ugly incident, which I'm no longer a fan of it. Big, whatever his name is. But that's where we played a doubleheader there my last time, and Brenner was on third, and they got the press probably threw it down the middle, and I hit it far enough in center field. One of my friends said, "Oh, you hit it to the wall." I said, "No, I didn't hit the wall, but he didn't have to slide. I hit it far enough where he came in standing up, which tied the game, which is always a good feeling." And when I went back to the bench, I got some nods of approval. And I think I made one other error. I made an error in Warner Robins playing at the Air Force Base, which was to me, very ironic that I go south because I'm trying to do what President Kennedy said and what Martin Luther King asked to help my country. Most of the white people don't like what I'm doing, but the military bases are integrated because they have to be by law since 48, 2 years after Jackie Robinson, because he integrated in 46 in baseball, 47 in the majors. So Harry Truman integrated in 48 in the military. But Warner Robins, we could play on the field there, and we were playing a team from Warner Robins. Somebody reserved it. We went in through the gates, and they knew we were coming. And no white people came to the game, but there was under the lights, and they were good lights. The guy hit a monster one-hop line drive at me at short, and it exploded and went by me, and it was an error. It was a hard play, but it was an error, and it cost us a run, and I felt real bad. And then we had, I've mentioned a couple of my players, one whose name I didn't know, and I'm not sure, he came to the reunion that I organized in 2002, which the article I met a guy who got me involved with the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame. He's a former player that lived there, a major leaguer. One of the guys played for the Jackie Robinson All-Stars, so I have that connection with Jackie Robinson. One of my teammates on my team, I don't know if he was playing on the team when I was there, but he was on the Macon Bombers, also toured with Jackie Robinson. He may have been there when I was there, I don't know that. But he came to the reunion, he did come to the reunion. I don't know if he played the summer I played. But the other guy was quite amazing, was a guy named Ralph Eason, who was built like not Ken Norton Jr., but Ken Norton Sr., the football player. He was tall and just built like a tree trunk. And he had never played pro ball, but he was really good. And Ralph hit one in Warner Robins. I haven't been back there, but they didn't have fences, but they had lights that were out like 300 something in left field, 375 in center, whatever. He hit it out of the lights. He turned us around. We won the game. So my error didn't cost us the game. So Ralph saved me that game. So the umpire saved me with the first error, and Ralph saved me with the second. So that was 2 errors in 5 games. So I wasn't playing great in the field. But again, I was not practicing too much. But yeah, Ralph. I remember Ralph hit the ball, and I don't think I ever found it. He probably hit it 500 feet, but he hit it. He was he was about 6'4", and he was just ripped muscles. He was a big, strong guy, and he hit it perfect, and it just went out of the lights and disappeared. And we won the game in Warner Robins. So we won 4 out of 5. The 5 games I played, we won 4 out of 5.
And when you mentioned reunions, you're talking about reunion of the baseball teams?
Yeah, we did, and the Macon Braves. At that time was the Mike Dunn, who's now the general manager of the Braves team up north of Atlanta. I'm blanking on the name. They built them a $25 million stadium, and they moved from Macon. They didn't have the irrigation to when it rained. What am I calling underneath all the major league stadiums, the drainage, and Macon wouldn't put the money in. They should have, because they lost their team. They had some independent teams, but the Macon Braves were in their last year there. Mike Dunn was great. In minor league teams, they always like promotions. So we had a Macon Bombers night, and it was very interesting because later on I did some clinics there, and the police were there and the military was there, and there was a policeman about my age who knew and then my friend Jim Godet, who played for Kansas City, who's a convert to Judaism. His wife Jamie's on radio there, and a chiropractor like my dad. So they had the police, and so we had a ceremony before the clinic, which Jim ran for 25 years. The police were there, and so he said that I had played there for the Macon Bombers. I was the only white in Macon Bombers. I could tell the police had been there for a long time, and so he knew that if I was the only white there, I was probably a civil rights worker. He may have been the guy that arrested me. It's but they were all very respectful. But we had a moment of contact where we both knew that we had some history. So that was interesting. And that field in Macon, Luther Williams Field, which was 1919, was one of the third oldest fields. That was used for the Jackie Robinson film that just came out. Most of the dugout scenes, which have blue screens behind them, because they recreated Ebbets Field and they recreated this film, but they filmed the train station there, and they filmed a number of the runway shots, and maybe even the shower shot, not the dugout shot, because that's a recreation of Ebbets Field. But they used that field, and Jackie actually played on that field because the Dodgers would Barmstorm. Roy Campanella, I have an interview in my book. What the Dodgers would do as a team is when they would come north out of Vero Beach, they would play in Birmingham, Montgomery, Jacksonville, and they would insist it must be after the first year when Jackie was there, and they didn't let an integrated audience. They said we'll come to your town and do an exhibition. Everybody gets to come. And so it was still segregation. It was before Brown versus Board of Education, things like that. When the Dodgers played, black people sat in the stands. And Jackie and Roy, and I have a picture in my book of them from Macon that I got from the library, but that same field where the actor played, Jackie played, which is kind of neat. Yeah. And that's maybe one of the reasons they went back there. I don't know. Same with Birmingham.
Okay, go back.
And you were arrested both in Macon and in Americus?
I was.
Yeah.
You want to hear those?
What were those?
Two kind of interesting, and one typical of my experience. First one, and I was the only one arrested in Macon. Eric Schiller, the minister, was the only one beaten up, and that was mainly because Bill Randall had told the town, you want Selma, you want Birmingham, or you want some business going on in your town. These white people were coming here. The change is coming, and he had already integrated the buses of the Randall family. He had an understanding with the white business establishment in Macon, and they were smart enough, and they already had 30% black vote of the Negro voters were registered, so they had some. That's why they sent us there, because they knew we could get some. Now, we were also being photographed by the White Citizens Council, who had an office across from where we were working at the courthouse. So it wasn't as though there were, and the Cline had a rally at the same park where we had the first integrated July 4th. So it wasn't as though nothing was going on, but in terms of the town leadership, the police chief and the mayor, they had a choice between Birmingham and terrible publicity, and Selma and terrible publicity, or trying to keep the lid on and keeping the business community going, which the Montgomery business community had done in the mid-50s. So there were people who were smart enough, and not obviously most Southerners, I would say even most, well, I don't know most. There were certainly many, many, many Southerners who were not happy with the White Citizens Council and the Klan, but to stand up was to be ostracized by terrorists. The Klan were terrorists. That's just what it was. And the Citizens Council had a lot of prominent business people besides people that weren't so prominent. So, and the politicians were beholden to them for votes and so on. So, but Bill Randall had done a lot of things, and he had an agreement with the police chief not to bother us, but apparently didn't get down to all the officers on the street. So I did a number of things that were sort of key, and I'm saying that, Joel Siegel says it, Stanford University has sent a team down called Project South. It's all in Green Library, all the transcripts and the audios, which I've examined. Joel Siegel, who was our administrative leader, when they'd hit his interview, singled me out as the hardest worker. So it's in his interview. So I was an athlete. I was in better shape probably than anybody, and I was extremely dedicated. The humidity really got to us from California. People were getting tired at 3 in the afternoon, and I said, hey, we've only got 10 weeks. We can't get tired at 3 in the afternoon. We got to keep going. And I was the pain in the ass. And I was also the youngest, except for one somebody who was also a freshman. What was her name? Elaine. Diane Hirsch was the radical of our group. She would have rather been with SNCC, but they didn't have a project that summer. Diane was very cool, too. But anyway, she became a nurse, married a Hispanic guy, and worked for the same union I did, but just after I did. And I've been chasing Diane around. If you ever heard of Diane Hirsch, she's now has a Hispanic last name. I'd love to touch base with her. She lived with Gloria Wise's family. In Americas, Gloria Wise was one of the 4 women arrested in the movement that pushed the voting rights bill out of Congress. They've been trying to stall it during scope, which is why Selma happened in March. Lyndon Johnson gave a speech about the bill in March, but there were 5 more months till August. The reason being, because of scope, the Southern legislators wanted to stall it till we left. Then there was no pressure for a strong enforcement clause. Because we were there, and after Americas, and when the bill was stalled, and the incident reports show we had, of the 90 projects, we had people in the street in 75. And the white community said, okay, enough. And the Southerners who were blocking said, okay, sign the fucking bill. I shouldn't have said that. But the bill got signed. But we had registered people, but in some places they couldn't register anybody. In many of the counties, they were blocked. Yeah. And that one of the reasons they sent us to Macon is because we could register people. Americas was almost impossible, and they were still arresting black women for standing in a white woman's voting line, which of course was illegal, in a year after the Civil Rights Act.
Or Terrell,
Yeah, well, you couldn't even get into Terrell. Yeah. Terrell was so bad. I mean, literally, I heard stories that we tried to move out from Sumter to other places, and they were already, of course, in Albany. There was a car that went into Terrell, and it was shot so many bullets at it, it turned around and came back. Terrell was one of the most terrible Terrell, one of the most notorious. I don't know what Charles Surratt in Albany thought of Terrell in '65, but the story I heard was we tried to go there, we got shot at, there were so many bullets at the county line, they were waiting. We turned around and people went back.
You got driven out of there in '61, so yeah, that had a long history of
right.
trying and not being able to.
So anyway, I had started, we first tried to go in the communities, the people would say yes and not be there, and we were wasting a lot of money. We were missing 3 out of 4 would tell us because we were white what we wanted to hear, like they did with most white people, and then they wouldn't be there because they were afraid to go downtown. Mm-hmm. Even in America, in Macon, even as good as it was in Macon, the fear level was still very high because people could get fired. They might be able to register, but then they would lose their job. So I then, on a Saturday, had a church bus, or on one day, it wasn't a Saturday, because we couldn't have registered on a Saturday, but maybe on a Friday. I had a church bus and I brought down 12 people. While they were in registering, people were walking by the courthouse and I just said, hey, would you like, I'm working with Dr. King, here's a leaflet, you can come register right now. And I got 7 more in 20 minutes. I went back and told Joel Segundo, hey, we can get them downtown. They go, well, it might be too dangerous. I said, we don't have much choice. We've just spent $200 in gas this last couple of weeks, and we've only got 44. We got to start making some numbers, and so we decided to give it a try. So, and then once we did that, and then that's when the Klan started, the White Citizens Council started photographing us. But the city also gave us 2 parking spaces. But we also moved down to the bars on Broadway, which is now Martin Luther King Drive, which is where the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame is, right near where I got arrested. So we went down to Broadway to get the people out of the bars and the pool halls, and Ken Long, who was my roommate, who was in Northern California, parked his old Oldsmobile there, I think. No, Joe Goldberg had an Oldsmobile. Ken Long had a Ford, I think. And he was in a waiting zone, but he was in a waiting zone for about half hour because we were soliciting the bars. Well, the police came and they didn't give him a chance to move. They started kind of saying stuff and they wrote him a ticket. And they weren't very nice. I then went in the barbershop. We were then trained by John Doerr and Bill Randall. If you're having trouble with the police, call and let us know what's going on in case you get taken away or whatever. Apparently, and this is honest truth, somebody said something. I don't know who it was. It made a smart aleck comment of some kind. That's what they said. It was not me. I'm looking in the eye, looking at the camera. I wasn't me. I just went in the barbershop and got on the phone. Apparently the police officer thought it was me, that I had said something. I don't know why he thought that, but at least that was his story. I think he really did think it was me. So I went in the barbershop and I've got Bill Randall on the phone and I said, Bill, or maybe it was Joel. I think it was Bill. I'm not sure. It was somebody at the office. I don't know if it was Bill Randall or Joel Siegel. Joel mostly stayed in the office. And I said, we're getting harassed here. We're down on Broadway. And I said, the policeman's coming in the barbershop. I think they're going to be arresting me. And I have to hang up. And in fact, they did. So they took me in the car, arrested me. They put me in the back seat, started driving. And again, we then had to go down to whatever the street is, turning rights towards the jail, turning lefts out to the country. And I just read these reports of the arrest people, take them out of the country, and they beat the crap out of them. So that's when I was nervous. Which way are they going to turn? I didn't mind going to jail. Our office was right across the street from the jail. Bill Randall was close to the jail. Bill Randall knew I was going to the jail. I had no doubt Bill Randall was going to take care of me. But I did not want to go the other way. So I was nervous. And then the two policemen are in the front. And I said, what am I being arrested for? I was on the phone in the barbershop. And so the police officer said, and I'm quoting now because I don't like to use the N word. He said, "You're a nigger lover and you're a smart aleck." And I said under my breath, I didn't know that was against the law. And he said, "What?" And I said, "No." And by that point he had turned right. So that was the only conversation I really remember. And that was, I don't know what the charge was, but that was the only charge I heard, that I was a, quote, lover and a smart aleck. That's why I think he really thought that I had said something. So I got into jail. And, I wasn't in the jail more than, I got booked. I was in, they put me behind bars. I wasn't behind the bars more than 10 minutes, and I was out. Bill Randall got me out. Not only that, and then actually Fred Hoffman, who did the film, which I can give you a DVD of, it's called Be Somebody, but he threw away all the stuff he didn't use. Well, I had, anyway, 16 millimeters. We had hours and hours of footage, which we could have done a full-length movie on. But he actually photographed me coming out of the jail across to Bill Randall's office. Incidentally, our office later became taken over by Capricorn Records, which was the Allman Brothers band. The Allman Brothers are from Macon, and Little Richard is from nearby, and Otis Redding is from Macon. So Phil Walden started Capricorn Records, and our office was above a liquor store, and eventually that entire block became Capricorn Records, which is now abandoned and should be a museum, really. But it's also the Scope office. So, and the famous little diner called H&H Diner was where the Allman Brothers went, where all the integrated band members, Otis Redding went there. That's still down the street. That was between Bill Randall's Macon Weekly newspaper office and our office, which then became Capricorn Records. So big historic blocks in Macon, Georgia, in the music industry, which is a big thing in Macon. They had the Music Hall of Fame, but they moved it there. It was a great Music Hall of Fame. They lost funding and the budget stuff. But anyway, so then they get me out, and I go into Bill's office, and Bill calls up the sheriff, or the police chief. And Bill, when he got excited, kind of talked tight. He said, Chief, what are you officers doing arresting this young man from UCLA? He said, I thought you understood that we weren't going to put up with any of this stuff. Your officers knew that. And so then he didn't say anything, and he barked at the police chief a couple more times, because Bill had a confrontation over the buses about 2 years earlier.
And what was Bill's position?
Bill Randall was Dr. King's friend, Hosea's friend. He ran a newspaper called the Macon Weekly. He had a construction company. He worked with Hosea on something called the Georgia Voters League. Have you ever heard of the Georgia Voters League? Okay, that was a network they had all around Georgia, probably other states. He was also involved with the NAACP. He was the local leader. Okay. Now, there was a more left-leaning local leader who also had a newspaper, but Bill was the one who worked with Hosea and Dr. King. There was a little rivalry between Bill and this other guy, but Fred, who was more leftist than the rest of us, he was older and an Air Force veteran. He kind of liked the more radical guy, but Bill was the guy. And Bill was the mainstream guy. That's why he went into politics, and his son is in politics, and a wonderful guy. And so then he turned to me and he said, well, Willie, the police chief would like to drop the charges if it's all right with you. And I said, well, I don't know, Bill, what do you think? He said, I think the police chief has told me that all of his officers are going to understand that they can't harass you all anymore, so I think you should let him drop the charges. I'm still not sure what the charges were. At that point, I don't think I knew actually what the official charge was. I don't think to this day, I don't know. I should probably go back there and see if those records are available. It may have been disturbing the peace. I don't really know. I heard that it was smart aleck and That's the only thing I was told. So I said, okay. So then Bill barked at the police chief a few more times, which made a big impression on me, by the way, that he was telling the police chiefs off and the police chief wanted to apologize. And I, of course, spread that around, and I think the police chief spread it around with his officers. And I don't think we had any more problems. Nobody else got arrested. And I was kind of the test case. It didn't work out good for the police officers. I don't know what happened to that guy, but like I say, he may have been the guy I met at the at Luther Williams Field many years later. I don't know. I think they all knew about it, though. I think they all knew about it. I'm sure they all knew about it because police chief knew. Police chief, I think, made sure they knew about it, and no one else got arrested. And we worked downtown from then on. And one of the things that happened was there was a guy named Denny Lenow, whose niece later had an official position with Habitat in Americas. And Denny ended up in the Peace Corps for a long time and working out of country for a long time. And I've been in touch with him just briefly. He was from a Mennonite school in the Midwest. And some other people, they had a guy came up in bib overalls with a gun, or the 38 or some gun, I don't know what caliber, not to me, but on the corner where we were trying to get voters, and he took the gun out, stuck it in his face, and he said, if you're in this corner now, I'm going to come back and kill you. Well, that didn't work. We stayed on the corners, the guy didn't come back and kill us. But, I mean, those kinds of things were going on in Macon, which was better than Americas, where they didn't come up to you, they just shot at you. They didn't give you any warnings. Later, the story was when I went back to Macon, there was a warning that if you're in town in 24 hours, you're dead. And it sounded serious enough that it made me uncomfortable. But of course, at 18, I wasn't going to leave then. And Bill said, no, you're going to leave. Time for you to go. And I was planning to leave anyway. But I wrote that in something I sent you. But in America, so that was my arrest there. Well, then the other time, William C. Randall, who I told you about, Mr. Randall's nephew, was very involved, was almost 16, had his learner's permit, but didn't, or was 16, had a learner's permit but no license. His uncle had been too busy, and his dad, I'm not sure I don't know what his dad's situation was. But of course, when you're 16, you like to drive and impress the girls, which I knew because I was only 18. I had been 16 years too earlier and wanted to drive to impress the girls. So we were on our way home one day from downtown, and William wanted me to let him drive. And he had the learner's permit, but it expired. He didn't have a license. So we got 3 blocks, and the girls, some pretty girls, were in the car, black girls, and I knew why he wanted. I was sympathetic. It was a male bonding thing, and I let him drive. Well, I was driving Ken's car that didn't have power steering. He knew how to drive, and he had driven his Uncle Bill's car that had power steering that he could just swing around. Well, he got to this corner, and he tried to do the swing around like he did with one finger. The wheel didn't swing, and we started into somebody's yard. Then, because he was an inexperienced driver, he got panicky, and he tried to hit the brake, but he hit the gas instead and rammed into a parked car in a black man's yard, who wasn't too happy when he came out. And he wasn't too confused about me because most people knew that the white people were there, but he wasn't too happy about somebody who just rammed into his car. Of course, I don't think that made a real good impression. It wasn't the impression that William C. wanted to make on the 2 black girls. I had done something similar, almost crashing my mom's car, so I sympathized with the whole thing. The black man was unhappy enough, he called the cops, and then William C. had a knife in his pocket, which I didn't know. So they arrested him for the knife, and I think the driving, and they arrested me. Now, they probably could have given us a ticket, but they weren't mean about it. We were obviously guilty, and I was obviously guilty of letting a minor without a license drive. And so they took us in, and we paid a $60, $5 fine, went to court. My dad sent the money. He wasn't thrilled about that, but of all the things that were happening, that was the least of his worries. I think I had to work it off when I got back, so I had to do some painting for him. And so that was my second arrest in Macon. I don't know how I get in these situations. I just seem to get in. America's a little more dramatic. I started telling the story about John Lewis. So we got called down there. Actually, quite interesting introduction to America. So we went down at night. It was the night after Andrew Watley had been killed. The 4 women were in jail. Dick Gregory was in town leading marches. Jose had started night marches. Vivid memory of the first night in a church. There was 2 young African-American guys with rifle at each doors. We slept in the pews, about 40 of us. What Jose wanted to do was bring in scope workers from all the projects around Georgia and Alabama. South Carolina was a little too far. And show us what a hot movement was like. Also, we needed more troops for the marches because once the women were arrested and then the white guy was killed, particularly when the white young man, when Andrew Watley was killed, all the state patrol came, 100 state patrolmen were there. The Klan had a rally. There were a lot of shootings going on. At people. No one else got hit. And so Jose wanted troops. This was going to be the Selma of the summer. And that's actually what he said in the New York Times and LA Times. Articles are in my book. And so we were the reinforcements. And so that night, there was a burned out car across the street that had been firebombed. So it was a lot different than Macon. And it was kind of into battle, essentially into battle, from the back lines to the front lines.
Can you define what this term hot movement means? That you've used the term hot movement.
I don't know what Jose called it. I know the way Jose described it. I think Jose would have said, "I want you to see what a real movement is like." I think those were, but a movement where the media was there, where there was mass demonstrations, where the opposition was making it life or death in some degree, which meant then that the media would portray it. The whole thing of nonviolence is to dramatize in a creative way. That's what Dr. King said in the letter from the Birmingham jail. Do a creative tension non-violently that will dramatize the injustice, that will expose the racism and the injustice, which is what the whole movement was about, from the Montgomery bus boycott on, where you had the media come because of violence, but compared the entire number of people that were killed in the movement from the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott till 1968, the end of your period, which I think is a good period. It's less than 1 day in Syria or in Egypt, where they've had the Arab Spring, and Barack Obama went and said, model the civil rights movement, but apparently they don't have the foundation, unfortunately. And we did have the Judeo-Christian foundation here. I'm not a scholar enough about Islam. I know there are many peaceful things in Islam, but that part of Barack Obama's speech, which, by the way, some in the Jewish community, because I know people in the Republican Jewish Committee, thought that Barack Obama was being anti-Israel by saying that in Cairo when he talked to the Egyptians at the beginning of his trip. What he was telling them is use nonviolence, which they tried and have done somewhat successfully, but the governmental structure has not supported it. We at least had a governmental structure in the United States that was based enough on law, even with the flaws in the federal government that Nick's talked about, and the corrupt federal judges, of which there were some, which the Kennedy administration acknowledges they made a mistake. They were lied to. I've talked to Burke Marshall. Those judges came up from Georgia and Mississippi and said, we promise you, Robert Kennedy called him in, and he said, if you're going to do this, you've got to follow federal law. And those judges looked him in the eye and lied to him. And they were made mistakes. There was the guy in South Georgia. They shouldn't keep getting beat up over it. It was a tough situation. I wish Nick would forgive that and understand that better and not feel so hurt about it. Same with this quote from, I know I'm getting off topic, but I want to say this, that David Garrow used and said that John F. Kennedy called SNCC sons of bitches when the two guys from Birmingham, three guys came up. The transcripts are in that book. What happened in that meeting was they tried to tell Kennedy, these three businessmen, get King out of there, get King out of there, he's causing trouble. Kennedy told them many times, and it's on tape, it's a civil rights tape at the Kennedy Library. There's a whole series. It's identified in my book, Place and Part. Garrow misrepresented it, and Frank Smith, who runs the African American Civil War Museum, knew the quote. SNCC is still angry about the quote. President Kennedy's a hypocrite. He called us sons of bitches. He was complimenting him. He said, you're tough sons of bitches. What happened was 7 times the white men from Birmingham said, get King out. And he told them, we didn't put King in there. We can't get him out. And by the way, King ain't the problem. Men from Birmingham didn't say that, but I'm quoting him. You're the problem. Your laws are the problem. Change your laws. Hire some black people in your stores. And then the guys from Birmingham said, oh, we can't have black people waiting on white people. Kennedy said, come on. He said the military, that was difficult in 1948. People had to live in barracks together and shower together. He said hiring people in stores, and you can listen on tape, he was magnificent. He says, that's nothing. That's the problem. King isn't the problem, you're the problem. And they, of course, they negotiated that problem out, and they did hire black people. And then finally, after they said 7 times, get King out, he said, look, you ought to be happy it's King and not SNCC. He said, they're tough. That John Lewis, they're sons of bitches. They're tough. You don't want them. You better take King, which is exactly, by the way, what Malcolm X said. You better take Dr. King and not me. John Kennedy described it the same way Malcolm X described it, but David Garrow took it out of context, and it was circulated through academia. SNCC knows that quote. They're hurt by it, and I want Andy to talk about it. Andy said, Dr. King talked about healing the sick. I want to heal SNCC's pain and tell them John Kennedy, who loved toughness. This is a tough guy who talked about macho 50-mile hike. He said, and I told Frank Smith, he said you were tougher than Dr. King. Frank Smith, he said, yes, we were tougher than Dr. King. Excuse me, Frank, I hope you see this. You weren't tougher than Dr. King. Nobody was tougher than Dr. King. But you were tough, and that's what President Kennedy said. He was complimenting you. So to get back to my next arrest, so we were down there. They needed volunteers. Every time there was a mass meeting, they asked for volunteers. I kept raising my hand. Pretty soon, Jose Williams knew who I was. Instead of one of 60 or 80 new white people, I was the kid that kept raising his hand and kept taking assignments. Well, as it happened, Andrew Watley had just been killed before we got there. His funeral was that Saturday at the Methodist Church. Or maybe it was the Baptist. There was two prominent churches where the mayor and the fire chief and the police, right across the street from each other on the same block. And they needed two whites to go to tell the media that were there covering it that there was a press conference coming up. So Eric Schiller, who was from UCLA, the minister, Reverend Eric Schiller, and we went. Now, if they would have known who we were, the white people, they would have been very unhappy we were there. But there were other people, and we were in suits. And in my one suit, my dad bought me at Sears for $25 for my high school prom. And by the way, my dad said he was proud of me. When I called my dad and told him I was going, it was the first time in my life. He said, no, I told you more. I said, well, he wasn't happy. He wanted me to be a musician, not a baseball player. But when I called him after I decided, I was very mature enough to say, I'm not going to ask my parents, because if I get killed, they'll feel guilty, more guilty than if I tell them I've already decided. And I was 18, people were going to Vietnam. And I told him, this is what I'm going to do. The line went silent. And he said, I'm proud of you. Those were the first words out of his mouth because of his feeling about Hubert Humphrey, all those things. So anyway, so they needed somebody to go to the church. Eric and I went. We took that assignment. Then they needed somebody to go with John Lewis the next day to try and integrate the Baptist church. Hand went up. Okay, you're going with John Lewis. The private, me, with one of the generals. You know, I always think of it as Dr. King was the Joint Chief of Staff's general. Jose was a general. John Lewis was a general. Abernathy was a general. Andy was a general. Dr. King was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the movement. And that's kind of how Jim Coliani set it out in his thing. So the interesting thing was, John and I go up there, and John's, of course, this is one of many, add a few more manys exponentially that John Lewis had been involved. My first time on camera as a movement person, other than the Citizens Council. They had me on camera. But so we go up there. I'm essentially an extra. John was the star, and I'm the extra with John. And he goes up there, and Fire Chief Henderson comes out. I think it was the Baptist church. And he has a tape recorder because he wants to record, and so nobody's misquoting him, which is fine with us. So he says, we don't want you here. We don't want you here. And we got actually footage of that on CBS News. And John Lewis says, well, but I'm a Baptist, and this is a Baptist church. We'd like to worship here. I'd like to worship here. No, we don't want you. He said, well, what about him? Pointing to me. He said, we don't want him either. And he's with you. We don't want. And he said, but then he said, but doesn't Jesus say that in Christ all men are equal? He starts quoting the scripture. He starts quoting Jesus Christ, because John's been to seminary. John was not a minister because he dropped out of seminary just before he graduated, but he had been to seminary, so he knew scripture. So he started quoting scripture to Fire Chief Henderson. Fire Chief Henderson got very flustered. That doesn't matter here. That doesn't matter here. Sheriff Chapel, arrest these people. Arrest these people. So that Fire Chief Henderson was quite unable to answer John Lewis when he started quoting scripture. He couldn't figure out a good answer as to why Jesus wouldn't want us in the church. So Fire Chief Henderson came, and we left. We didn't get arrested, but I don't know if we said we'll be back, but we came back. So that was one of the big deals, and that was on national news. And some of my baseball friends saw me. They got back and they said, well, yeah, I saw you on national news. And that was on all the three networks. Night, that was a big story. That's where all the media was. Once Andrew Watley had been killed, there were media there anyway, but once there was a killing, of course the media wanted to see if there were going to be more killings, whatever. But I mean, they were doing a great job. Tom Brokaw was there, did a great job. The media was doing great work in those days. I shouldn't have said it in that way, but obviously that brings, it's not the planes that land that bring the media, it's the ones that don't land. So we were then working, I got shot at that week at close range twice. And then we went back to the church the next week. That week, John took his group to the Baptist church, and Willie Bolden took a group to the Methodist church. I don't think anybody, I don't know, somebody may have gone to the Methodist church that first week too. I don't know. I was at the Baptist church with John. And that photo actually ended up in Ebony magazine 8 months later. They did a special article about the movement and Christianity, and they talked about the America's churches. And that was part of Jose's plan. Jose said, the media's here, we're going to dramatize the churches. And nobody from the white community could have said that was unfair, or today could say it, because Lena Turner, who had been a SNCC worker who later worked with Scope, because at that point, a number of people in SNCC also worked and were paid by SCLC. Lena Turner was one of them. She was also one of the women arrested. She went, after the '64 Civil Rights Act, to every white church in town. Every church in America let her in, except the First Baptist and the First Methodist, where the big, important people were. So we knew who those two, they knew, and the local people told Jose that. So that was part of the plan. We're going to expose this unchristian-like behavior. The difference at the Methodist Church is their national body had passed a law, an edict saying no one could be refused. I'm not sure that Lena knew that at the time or let them know. But the next week,
What's her name?
I was
Lena?
Turner. I believe Lena is still alive in Detroit, last I heard. I tried to contact her, and she did not come down for the Sumter County Movement Remembered. They have an organization which is very active. Sam Mahone is the co-chair. Gloria Wise, who was one of the other women arrested, is deceased, but her sister Jewel, unfortunately, had a stroke. It's a dear friend, is involved with that. Mamie P. Campbell was one of the other women arrested. They're listed in my book in the articles. She's still alive. But that's why I think it would be great if you talk to Sam Mahone. That's a very active organization that is not embittered and are teaching their history. I think Sumter County, more than any county, more than Albany, more than Selma, Lowndes County, because of Koinonia and because of being the founding place of Habitat. And also Andersonville is there, the Civil War cemetery. So it's an amazing history from the Civil War up through the movement. And the legacy is also Habitat, which is part of Koinonia, which is very positive. And unfortunately, some of the other legacies are not so positive. Americus is a glorious story, but I'm at Sumter County. So anyway, so as we're going up to the Methodist Church, Willie Bolden is leading the group because he's one of Dr. King's lieutenants, one of Jose's lieutenants. Now Reverend Willie Bolden, not at the time, it wasn't Reverend Willie Bolden. And he said, Willie, he said to me, I can't get arrested today. I'm leading the movement here. You lead the group. Why he picked me, I mean, I'd only been around for 10 days. Of the people there, I guess I had been volunteering more. So I then led that group to the Methodist Church, and we were told, you can't come in. They met us in the line, and some of them had blackjacks. And they said, you can't worship here. And I said, could we? And I think either he told me or I knew that. I don't know how it was, but I think we knew we wanted to say a prayer if we couldn't go. So I said, can we say a prayer? And they said yes, before we were arrested.
And this is a group of blacks and whites together?
Yes,
Yeah.
and the UCLA group of mostly UCLA students. Chuck Hammond, Elaine Svonkin, all of us that were on this telegram that Rick Tuttle had sent, and are in the picture that was on every front page in LA Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, New York Times. They shot the picture from across the street, and so I'm in the front, so I'm barely seen. You can barely see me. I do have the news footage of it, though, which is kind of interesting to watch. And so also interesting to listen to the Stanford interview where I'm much less hyper then. I think I came back with post-traumatic stress and have been more hyper ever since than I ever was before. Not that I wasn't hyper before. But anyway, so we knelt, said the prayer, and then they arrested us, took us to jail. And then John Lewis had another interesting moment. We get in the jail with Sheriff Chappell, and he says, okay, what's over here? The polite term in those days was nigras. And of course, the joke in the movement was, for the white people said, well, that's our southern accent. We can't say negro, because we don't say gro, we say gra, so we say nigra. We're not being rude. And so the black people would say, those white people can say ni, and they can say gro, so they can say negro. And so, but Sheriff Chappell said nigra, and that was probably better than he said most of the time, frankly. This is who Jimmy Carter had said was my dear friend, because Jimmy Carter had a lot of dear friends down there because he was from Plains. The man that beat Bill Rao, next to David Bell, whose family I stayed with, was the former state rep who served with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy, by the way, stayed neutral, which is not the worst thing in the world. He ordered both the Klan and the movement and the reporters, which is written about by the AJC guy in his book that won the Pulitzer Prize, off his property. What Florence Jordan told me was that Jimmy knew that he couldn't stay in business if he took sides. If he showed any sympathy, he wasn't going to have a peanut business. And he had kids and everything else. So he did his missionary work, which he did do at the time, outside of Plains.
Right.
But he did tell the Klan came and wanted him to join. He said, "Get off my property, I'm not joining." Because he was a Navy veteran. And the New York Times came and he said, "Get off my property, I'm not talking to you." And anyway, but the guy that served with him was the one who beat Bill Rowell, would have been to death, but David fell on top of him. But anyway, so, but what happened in the jail, so Sheriff Chapel said, "Niggers over here, white people over here." And John said, "Well, that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act of '64. You can't segregate us in the jail. You can't do that." And Sheriff Chapel said, "Well, you may run the streets, but you don't run this jail." And John said, "Well, I don't run this." He says, "Yes, you do, but you don't run this jail. Get over there." And so they segregated us in the jail, which of course gave John a chance to talk to the two guys that had been arrested for shooting Andrew Watley, who he claimed was innocent. They eventually went to prison. I don't know what the details were as far as what actually happened. But the shooting was in retaliation for a lot of violence directed towards the marchers. And that night, those guys said, "Enough. We're not going to have our people." They were throwing broken glass at kids, and it was not. And they were shooting at people. One of the other nice things that was happening in Americas was, as they released people, not from the county jail, but the city jail, which was downtown. I was in the county jail. Fire station was across the street, and the firemen had hunting slingshots and ball bearings, and they were shooting the slingshots, which could have killed somebody, put their eye out. They may have been good enough shots that they weren't hitting people, but they were ricocheting off as they knew when they were being released, and they were shooting. The other story in there that's amazing is Warren Fordson, who was Jimmy Carter's lawyer, who came out for a biracial council, which the whites wouldn't agree to in the beginning, was actually run out of town. He was a white guy. And his brother was Ben Fordson, the sitting Secretary of State. And to me, that really showed how bad the repression was. If the brother of the sitting Secretary of State in Atlanta, 150 miles away, could not be protected. I mean, this is the brother of the Secretary of State who knows the governor, who was a liberal, Carl Sanders, and can't mobilize the state patrol that he feels he has to leave for his own safety. It's pretty dangerous. And that article is in my book, and he left. Warren Fordson left. But they did create a biracial council within about 2 weeks. About 2 weeks after those demonstrations, there was a biracial council because the white leaders were getting terrible publicity, and they knew that they couldn't, that they were going to lose. So the other guy I would like to mention is a guy named Red Hefner. Have you ever heard of Red Hefner?
Yes, I have.
Red Hefner was then working for the Community Relations Service. I also met Jack Nelson of the LA Times down there. But Americus was where I got to meet, kind of where I proved myself in battle, you could say, and where I met a lot of really substantial, interesting people because of what was happening there. Red Hefner was run out. He wrote, Harding Carter wrote the one that worked for Jimmy Carter, wrote a book called So the Hefners Left Mississippi. The interesting story was Red Hefner's eldest daughter was Miss Mississippi in the Miss USA pageant, Miss America pageant, the main pageant. And she was what Virginia Durr's autobiography is called Outside the Magic Circle. If you don't know much about Virginia Durr, you should read her. I got to meet her when she was quite elderly. But the Magic Circle, do you know what the Magic Circle was? Magic Circle for white women was what Virginia Durr said. As long as white women in the South stayed inside the Magic Circle, they were catered to, they were taken care of, they were on a pedestal. And of course, they couldn't be defiled by any black men. Of course, so one of the excuses was, you want them to marry your sister, right, or whatever, Right. But so they were put on a pedestal. It's a great story from Selma. There was actually an interracial couple in Selma. The daughter was from a prominent family, so prominent that the whites couldn't retaliate against the black guy, who was still there by 65. You know how they handled that problem? The family just decided she was no longer white. That solved the problem. She was no longer white, so there was no longer a problem. Okay. And they all in the town, all the white people agreed, well, she's not white. She's not white. We don't have, That's how because she was She was too prominent to kill, and the black guy was too prominent to kill. You couldn't do it because they were one of the town leaders. So how do you solve that problem in Selma, Alabama? She ceases to be white. And this is absolute truth. I forget the guy's name, but that's a great story from Selma. So the South was so conflicted with all this. Another story that's so interesting is that, Janet Merritt was a woman who was a state rep after the guy who was beating people up. She stepped outside the magic circle. She later got defeated, but she was in for 3 terms. Another one, I have one of her, was a great artist. I got one of her. I got to meet all these wonderful people. But anyway, so Red Hefner was down there, and he had to leave Macomb, Mississippi, because all he did is have some blacks and whites at his house to discuss the problem. He was an insurance man. They poisoned his dog. They threatened his family. And he left, and he got taken in by the Community Relations Service, run by Leroy Collins, former governor of Florida, who Andy Young was friends with. And he was down there. And I got to know him, and very, impressive guy. And he was now working for the Department of Justice. So and of course the younger daughter, who wasn't Miss Mississippi, kind of got it that the family had to leave. The one that was Mississippi, why do I have to leave my friends? I'm Miss Mississippi. I don't want to leave my, she was on the pedestal. Virginia Durr got outside the magic circle when she worked with Eleanor Roosevelt in the New Deal. Wonderful lady. So, and all the same with Florence Jordan and Clarence Jordan out of Koinonia. So we got put in there with about 3 of the white guys that had been throwing broken glass at black kids and 1 civil rights worker, and they were having a card game. When they finished the card game, they were going to beat him up. Then 6 of us came in, so that part was over. They weren't going to beat him up, but they really were. There was a number of times where I had to question nonviolence. One was when Judson Ford put his gun in his belt when we were going out to get the people out in the county areas of Sumter County, which I was actually happy about because I'd already been shot at. But it was still a conflict. This is not what Dr. King would really approve of, but it doesn't matter. We're not in a demonstration. The other time was listening to these white guys, and it was ugly. It was similar sort of to the Ben Chapman character that was a true character in the Jackie Robinson movie, the manager of the Phillies, who was the worst antagonist and the worst of the language. And I think I had to put my hands over my ears. And it was making me sick where I wanted to beat the crap out of these guys, which was against the rules.
And they were deliberately trying to provoke you?
No, that's just who they were.
Okay.
They were just talking about us, and they were talking about black people, and that's just how they talked. They were not nice people. They were not of the higher classes, let's say. And but had they started a fight, I could have defended, but I couldn't go attack them. That would have been against what I had pledged myself to nonviolence. But it made me very, very angry. I mean, I wanted, and it probably connected emotionally to hearing Kike when I was I didn't think of it at the time, but it was a very deep connection, and I just wanted to shut up. I think, but nonviolence was you ignored them, you turned the other cheek, and by the time I left, I was pretty much said, many of us could practice it, we could not be it. Dr. King could live it. Jose Williams was not a nonviolent guy. It's one of the reasons Nick doesn't like him so much, because he got in their face. He got very angry at people. He had a temper. He didn't put up with stuff. But he practiced nonviolence during the movement and in demonstrations. He walked across the bridge into the battle. I found out by the end of the summer I could not practice. I could not be spiritually a nonviolent person. Maybe too much football, maybe kike when I was young, maybe too angry. In my core, I had enough abuse. I didn't want to take it anymore. And I also had post-traumatic stress at that point from the shootings and the stress of being scared every day. I mean, if you're scared, if you have the fight or flight syndrome and you can't do either, you internalize, and that's not very good for you. And plus I got shot at from 6 feet away. I got, from the next car, which totally scared me.
Is that while you were trying to register voters?
No, that was when we were trying to organize a Madrian, which was going to be a great opening scene in my movie after the movie helped. But ironically, amazingly, really, I'm an Americus. Who do I run into? A guy from Grant High School named Rich Adler, who was I was a sports editor. He was in the Hall of Fame as a gymnast. He was a ring guy, like most gymnasts, small and very muscular because they have to low weight, in their bottom. So a lot of little guys with big arms. Rich was about 5'7", dark hair, Jewish, And he had joined SNCC somewhere or another. I don't know if he went, I don't know where he was at college, but somehow he'd gotten involved with SNCC. He's down there. And in between the week going to churches, I run into Rich. Hey, Rich, how you doing? Da, 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 da. I hadn't seen him in a year because I'd been to college. Maybe two, I'm trying to think if he was I think he was a year ahead of me. Maybe not. He was either in my class or a year ahead of me. But I knew him, and he was a good athlete, and a lot of athletes knew each other. We didn't run in the same group, but I know he was in the Hall of Fame because I wrote about him, and I don't know if it was my junior year or my senior year, but he was a real good gymnast. He was all league gymnast, and he had been beaten. He's in the news accounts in my book. He had been surrounded by a group of whites and beaten up and broken through. He was a strong guy, but and he was also in theory pledged nonviolence, but he wasn't going to beat. 10 guys were going to beat him up, so he broke through the crowd and got away. But they did beat him, and it was in the paper. He was injured, whatever. But he came to me and he said, "Hey, we're organizing a maid union. These maids are working 80 hours for $20 a week. Let's organize a maid union." Well, that didn't come from Jose. Jose was doing the churches and the marches, but I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Little did I know. Well, the other unfortunate thing was Fred Hoffman, the guy who made the movie Be Somebody, who was an Air Force veteran who was 29, his car was there. He had a Citroen, probably like a 1963 Citroen. Let me tell you, I don't think there were any other Citroens in the state of Georgia. There certainly was no other Citroens. I think he may have had Georgia plates on by that time, but it didn't matter. There were no Citroens in Americas, and all the white people knew that if there was a Citroen, it must be an outsider. And that was the car I had. I had Fred's car. Not good thinking on my 18-year. I think I was probably wearing my number 10 jersey and driving a Citroen, going to try and organize a maids union. That was a third strike. That was not good. So, but Rich convinced. So I just, I didn't think about it very clearly. There was so much going on that, hey, we're on the organizing. Okay, good. All right. What are you doing? He said, well, we got to go around and pick up the maids and take them to a meeting at the Freedom Center. Freedom Center is. There's the Freedom Center. That was a little building owned by Barnum's family that owned Barnum's Funeral Home, which was one of the other centers of the movement there, whose family had gone to jail, wealthy family. The Barbers had independent clients. They were independent. The funeral people and the ministers. Everybody else was beholden to the white community, including the teachers, in those segregated days. So we went around to a couple of places. They said no. The women went. They seemed fearful. It was one of the few times I really saw people fearful. And this was the week that Andrew Watley had been killed. State Patrol had been sent there. The Cline had a rally. Lester Maddox was in town. It was a pretty busy week in Americus, Georgia. And I've got some of the news footage from that. But the maids wouldn't get in the car with two white boys. I think the other thing was that we're not getting in the car with you two white boys because that ain't going to go over big with the white community. And they may hate you more than us, but they may miss you and hit us when they shoot at you. So they wouldn't come in the car. So I remember very vividly, and in those days, in most of the black communities, there was not a ghetto. It wasn't even so much the other side of the tracks, in at least the communities where I was. The black neighborhoods were scattered throughout the downtown here. Fancy white neighborhood could be a little black poor neighborhood here, a little black poor neighborhood here. There were pockets, 2 or 3 maybe. So we had to drive through from a black neighborhood through white downtown over to another black neighborhood. And as we came out from the last group that we were talking, we couldn't get anybody to come. We sort of gave up at that point. I noticed there was a pickup. I think I may have noticed the pickup truck on the way in, but I definitely noticed it on the way out. And as we left, it followed, and I noticed because things were going on. I mean, that was the first time I got shot at, but it was a dangerous time. So I noticed, and there had been bricks. The guy I was living with, the David Bell's family, Bill Rao, had 13 stitches in his chin. They had driven by and thrown a brick at him, hit him with a brick, then chased him and beat him with sticks. And he had also broken some fingers, and then David was 17 later in the military. He's in Albany. He's a social worker now, David Bell. You might try and find David. And I'd stayed in touch with his mom for years, and I think David may be divorced now with 3 kids, but he was stationed at Fort Benning for many years. He was in the military for 20 years. Ironically, Bill Rao's brother was a chaplain in the military at Fort Benning. When Bill went missing, my only contact with the FBI that summer, I have a file now from the thread in Macon at the gas station, was I called the Albany office. Bill, we were always told to keep tabs. If you're going out, tell people when you're coming back. And if you're not back, then try and find out what happened. So Bill was gone. He had been beaten up, and he was missing, essentially 6 hours late. So I called the FBI field office in Albany, and I got one of the ones that Dr. King criticized for being a Southerner who wasn't sympathetic with the movement. And it was, oh yeah? He said, you call us back if you find the body. Click. That was how much they were interested in helping. That was not the case of the FBI agents sent after John Doerr got the complaint that I made to Joel Siegel, that Joel Siegel sent to him. That's in that book. You can read their interviews of the people they chased her all over Georgia who had made the threats, and their communication with power service stations, which convinced power service stations it's not a good enough excuse to say that you're hiring people that aren't taking down the white-only signs. You better take down the white-only signs at your gas stations or you're going to be in trouble. It's not going to be anybody else but your corporate office, and the white-only signs came down. But anyway, so the car followed us, and because I knew of the brick being thrown as the car came up the side of us, I can't remember, I'm trying to write it for the screenplay now, and I don't really remember if I said anything like, look out, Rich, or whatever, but I started rolling down the window. Not that Fred had air conditioning, the windows were probably half down anyway, because I didn't want a brick to hit the window and shatter. Not that it may have been shatterproof glass, but because I was bunking and sharing a bedroom with Bill, and he had been hit by a brick, I was thinking more brick than gun. Instead, what happened, the car came up, was a pickup truck. Gun came out about this far away. I mean, I'm here, I'm the driver, the passenger, car pulls up, the passenger sticks the gun out, bang, bang, bang. As soon as I saw the gun, I ducked, Rich ducked, heard the shots, hit the brake, and started looking for the bullet holes. And they took off, the shooters left, and there were no bullet holes, which was very confusing to me because I wasn't far away. To this day, I don't know whether the bullets went through the window or whether they were blanks. Now, I've talked to somebody in the military. They for whatever reason, they said, I think it was bullets. I don't think they would have gotten all that trouble with blanks. On the other hand, it was a good way to scare me and not kill me, because it scared me. It scared both of us. Rich, I think, did leave. I've only talked to him once since then. I've tried to find him, actually. I haven't been able to find him. And he said, I thought I was driving. I said, no, Rich, I was driving. But but he had already been, and then they may have been going after him. He may have been, but I had already been to the church. So he had been already beaten up. I had been to the church. We were both ID'd at that point. See, when we first came down, one of the reasons I got sent to the church for the funeral was they didn't know who we were. But it didn't take long, and by that time both Rich and I were known. So I don't know who they were following, or they were certainly following the car. And to this day, I don't know. The next day I got shot at again, and I heard the bullet hit the bushes, so I know that was a real bullet. And I was just walking with about 4 black guys. Truck came by. Now, I don't know if the same truck or not, because I didn't look close enough at the truck the first day. That was all pretty quick, the first day. But the second day, I was scared. I was terrified. I dove in the bushes. The black guys knew instinctively they would be shooting at me. The whites, I don't even know if you've heard this before, the whites hated the white civil rights workers more than they hated the blacks. They understood the blacks. They wanted their freedom. Why the hell were the white people helping them? We were race traders. We were white niggers. We were called white niggers sometimes. So the black guys knew that if they were shooting at somebody, and a lot of black people will tell you this, freedom fighters, Bob, who's was a UCLA freedom fighter, his wife, Helen Singleton, Bob and Helen Singleton. Helen is on what's his name book, the Freedom Rider book, on the cover. I was at Rick Tuttle's house at a dinner with Helen, with a journalist. She told him, no, when we were freedom riders, they hated the whites more. Among moving people that are honest with you, they'll tell you that. And it makes sense. They understood the black people. They didn't like them, they hated them, but they knew why they were doing it. Why were we doing it? We were traitors. And they wanted to make us an example. Without us, the black people, they could kill them without trouble. So they weren't thinking very clearly, because once they killed us, that was even worse. But the black guys kind of laughed at me when I dove in the bushes that second day. They didn't dive in the bushes. I dove in. I was afraid they were going to come back. I was scared. I was very scared by this. Now, I've told people, and I think it's really true, the first day really scared me. But it went away. I mean, I was shook up, and I told people it's in the incident reports. And I think the group from Macon didn't want me to stay because they were afraid I was going to get killed. But the second one had a far more lasting effect. If it happens once, you say, well, it happened once, never going to happen again. When it happens the second time, you don't know when the third time is. And particularly, even to this day, I don't like cars to follow me. When I drove between Macon and Americus the rest of that summer, no one ever passed me. I knew I had post-traumatic stress when I got back. I stayed 2 weeks extra, almost 3 weeks extra for the election in Macon. That was my thing for the people in Macon. No, you can't leave. We need you here. Everybody knows number 10. I said, no, Jose wants to put me on the staff. He wants me to be in Americas. I'll come back. He said, you're deserting the people in Macon. No, I'll come back. I'll work in the election. Our FICO project was 10 weeks, June 14th, August 28th. The election was September 15th in Macon. I said, well, gosh, school doesn't start till the 19th. We've registered all these voters. We registered over 3,000 voters in Macon. Now our job is to get them to vote. That's the whole point. But everybody else decided they wanted to leave. They did their time. They did their tour. Everybody left. Except Merle. Merle was going to come back, but he left too. He eventually did come back, Merle Roos. So I stayed, and anyway, when I got back, and that was when I got the threat from the Klan the night before I left. But when I got back, when I was driving down to see Ken Long, I was on the Long Beach Freeway. The other people also, they drove back. They had time to decompress. From a night 24 hours earlier, they said, if you're still in town in 24 hours, you're dead. 24 hours later, I landed in LA. I had no decompression time.
Where did this threat come from?
The night of the election. Oh, you didn't read that in my article I sent you. That was in the B'nai B'rith article.
Yeah.
When I stayed for the election in Macon, and it was the first black who'd run since Reconstruction. It was for water commissioner. They said in the article, they changed it for commissioner. He wasn't a commissioner, but it was water. It was Reverend Marcus Moon. He was a barber and a minister. Because if he didn't have a full-time church, he needed to support himself. But he stood up. He said, okay, Bill Randall needed a candidate. He decided to be the candidate. The morning of the election, they changed every polling place in Macon. At least we knew we had an impact. And they put the directions in box score print. Now, many of the black people had not had good educations. The tiny print was very hard to read. Plus, and I think some of them may have been in white neighborhoods. I don't know. But all of our plans for getting people to the polls were thrown, and of course the white people that did this knew they were doing that. That's why the Voting Rights Act needs to be kept active and approved, so that will never happen again. And I am sympathetic to Alabama and other places that say we haven't had this discrimination in years. The problem is, this is politics. This has nothing to do with race. This could happen. This probably happens in places that aren't under the Voting Rights Act if they can get away with it, because, excuse it, language for lawyers. If lawyers run things, they figure a way to get around and manipulate laws. That's what the adversary system, which I don't like because I've been involved with civil rights law, sets up. If we can get away with it, we do it. Doesn't matter whether you're innocent or guilty, whatever. It's, you do what you can get away with, and that's part of the adversary system. I understand there's a value to that as well. But that's why the voting right, and that's why scope, and Rick Tuttle is the one that said this in my book. Here's what Rick Tuttle said, how important scope was, which is ironic because he's quoted in my book and I give him credit for it. The voting rights, Selma happened in March. Voting Rights Act was stalled till the 6th of August. Watts blew up on the 11th. If the Voting Rights Act and all the moral support of the churches, the white community, the labor unions was powerful supporting the Voting Rights Act. If we hadn't got it done by the 6th and the Watts riots or Watts rebellion had happened, some of that white support through the churches and the unions would have been weakened. And there was always going to be a Voting Rights Act. The key question was exactly what's still being debated, the enforcement clause. And that's what the Southerners were stalling for and negotiating for, no enforcement clause. Because, of course, without an enforcement clause, the law would have been meaningless, just like the one in 57. That's why scope was very, very critical to the Voting Rights Act, both pushing it out of committee and as Rick Tuttle, who's a PhD in history, explained to me, apparently not to you, why scope was important was because we kept the pressure on and got that vote signed before the first explosion in the North, the worst of the first explosion. So, but when I was driving on the Long Beach Freeway, while I was talking about post-traumatic stress, the same lights that bothered me in the South still bothered me, and I didn't want them to follow me. And I thought, wait a second, that's not right. That's like the guy said it's not right when the white woman called him with his mother. I said, that's not right. I'm not in Georgia anymore. Those people aren't following me. But emotionally, I wanted to get away from them. I didn't want them to pass me. Once that car passed me, I never let another car pass me the rest of the summer, and I still don't like cars to pass me. Because I mean, you and I know intellectually, and I pretty much know emotionally, that next car ain't going to shoot at me again, but I'm not 100% sure. That's what post-traumatic stress is. Just like these guys who come back from the IUDs. I don't know what they go through, because they've had far more, although we have a gun stuck in your face and bullet shot, that's pretty scary. But I have to watch myself now, that when cars are behind me, I have to calm myself down and say, this is what's going on, this is kicking in, just relax. It's not 1965. But when I first got back, that was just one of many things. I got depressed after that, and no one really knew what it was back then. They called it battle fatigue. And actually, I did see the campus psychologist at UCLA, and they said, well, people from the Peace Corps, they didn't associate it with the danger. What they said, because I don't know if I verbalized, I don't know if I understood that part, but they said people coming back from the Peace Corps from such an intense emotional experience, being bonded so closely every day with people in very intense work, sometimes have had readjustment things. And that's what they told me at UCLA when I made one attempt to figure out what was going on. Solitary confinement. LA County Jail, but that's the second movie. That's the movie in the South is called The Summer in the South, and if that ever gets made, the one in LA will be called A Fall in LA.
Okay.
112 days, and I tell you, 112 days is not a long time in jail, but it's a pretty long time in jail.
Well, I want to ask about that quickly, but I just want to follow up on, because I think the PTSD and movement burnout, this is a very important thing.
Very important for SNCC. I don't think they understand it. I don't think the SNCC people have ever come to grips. And it's no shame. I mean, it is what it is. It's just your emotional system can only take so much. And I think their hostility towards Dr. King, some of the same stuff, they feel they haven't got enough credit. They're operating out of those same feelings that they had at the time of all the sacrifices they and their colleagues made. Some of them were shot down right in front of them, and nobody was ever, penalized for it. It's like Jonathan Daniels, the guy was in jail for 8 hours. And that was very important to me too, because that was while I was there, and that was not that far away from where I was. I actually had post-traumatic stress to go to Hayneville. I had a real struggle going there to publicize my books for Black Belt Press. And I talked to Randall one of the times he helped me. He said, I understand what you're going through, but it'll be good for you to go there. I said, I know they're not going to shoot me there, but they shot somebody and killed somebody there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there because it makes me afraid. Because I got shot at. And you know what happened is I went there, first person I saw was a black sheriff. I wasn't afraid anymore. See, black people were the good then. They weren't the ones that were going to shoot me anymore. It was the white people. Except when I was in jail, I had some Nation of Islam people that didn't care that I worked for Dr. King. I got some stitches in my eye from a fight in LA County Jail. That's a different story, though.
But was the civil rights movement related to?
It was. It was when I was Dr. King's college coordinator. Yeah, it was over a fair housing thing. Some black kids in Santa Monica had come and heard my music and wanted to hang out. I talked to their mom. I don't think they didn't have a dad, and I was working around my place in Santa Monica in a little court. And then I got a call I just moved in. I got a call from the landlord who said, my wife's father just died in Italy. She's upset. Somebody called and said they were going to bomb my place because you had black people there. This was the fall of '66. And I had met a lot of white people in the South, some very good. Betty Adams was a woman from the Methodist Church. We had the first integrated church meeting in Macon because of Betty Adams. We had a youth. She said, you're working with when I was there for those extra 3 weeks, a number of interesting things happened. You asked me about the threat. I'll finish that. But Betty came. One of the good things that happened is Betty said, listen, she found me and she said she was the first white woman in the postal department. So she was a feminist before feminism became feminism. And a lot of the men didn't like her working in the post office because that was a man's job. And she now raises dash hounds in the north of Macon. I've since seen her. And her husband kind of put up with all of her integration and stuff. But she said, yeah, I'm working with the white Methodist youth and you're working with the black Methodist youth. Why don't we have a meeting at my house? And we did. And that was the first integrated meeting. And her husband, B.H. Chief Adams, good old Southern boy, he let his wife do it, because the wife, of course, runs usually the marriage anyway. But that was the first integration. That was for a local white woman. There was a guy named Bob Brenner, who I believe is now a lay minister, was going to William and Mary. He reached out to me, and I later saw him. He had a religious house there. That summer I met him through the church, through the Methodist Church. I think he was at that meeting, actually. And what happened with the threat, I was carrying the people down to vote for Marcus Moon. That night after the election, I'm at Bill Randall's office with his son Harry, who worked for the state. Harry gets a call, and he said, "It's for you." It was calling me at Bill Randall's office. Actually, it was at our office. It was at our scope office. Yeah, I think it was, or maybe it was Bill's office to make a week. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think it was our scope office. I got on the phone, and I could tell it was a white voice. It sounded like a nice white man, and he said, Are you the white man? And I really liked it because I was 18 and he called me a man, and I thought this was a compliment. He was going to say something nice to me. Are you the white man that was carrying the niggers down to vote today? And I said, yes. And then the voice changed, and it wasn't nice anymore. And it said, if you're still here in 24 hours, you're dead. Click. And it was a very serious, it wasn't saying you're going to be, better be careful. It was saying you're here in 24 hours and you're dead. Click. And I said, I told Bill, I said, I'm not leaving. And Bill said, oh, yes, you're leaving. You're leaving tomorrow morning. Because I had already been scheduled to go by Dr. King's office, everybody else drove back. Because I stayed, and I was then an SCLC field staff. I had met with Dr. King. I can tell you about that if you want, and became a member of the staff. Then I got a check with Dr. King's signature, which of course I wish I'd saved, and took it to the airport and got my ticket. And so Bill Randall was already scheduled, because I had to get back to school. I had stayed 3 weeks extra, but I was, the election was over. It was time for me to go home. So I was already scheduled to go. And Bill said, but I said, no, they're not going to run me out of town. And he said, yeah, it's time for you to go. I'm taking you tomorrow morning. I'll be at your house. We're going. We're not discussing this. Which probably had I sobered up for a second, I would have. I mean, I wasn't, but that was kind of what the movement was, is you're making your point, whatever. And I had been threatened a lot, and I was getting tired. Anyway, whatever. So I got on the plane, I fell asleep, I woke up, and I'm back in LA. And 2 nights later, I'm scared driving to Long Beach. So, you want to hear the Dr. King story real quick, or you wanted to hear? Do you want me to finish I can tell you the real quick story of the Santa Monica.
Yeah,
so I'm Dr. King's college.
Just a little bit about being the coordinator on the West Coast, because I think that's important to know.
I got to thank Dr. King. I like to tell people about thanking Dr. King because that was very special. Sure. At the end of the summer, they just called. They got about 40 of us. I think they probably asked 60 or 70 of the people they felt did well enough on their work to join the field staff and commit a year to your life. That was what Jose came to me. He said, you've done a good job here. We got a lot more work to do. I want to keep scope going. I want you to commit a year to your life. Stay down with us. And I said, and I want you to come on staff now. So I went on staff in Americas. And I said, I knew my dad didn't like it too much if I hadn't had parental permission. I was also getting a little worn out, but I also knew that I'd be classified 1A. I'd lose my student deferment, so I wasn't going to be. I don't know how Jose was going to figure that out. And I don't know, maybe some other women didn't have that problem, and some did stay. The guys that did, I don't know how they worked that out. Maybe they had to deferment, pacifist deferment, whatever. But I didn't have a deferment. So I said, but I'll stay 2 weeks. I'll stay for the election in Macon. So that was fine. So the day the project officially ended, which was August 28th, which is actually the anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, that was the official date of the conclusion. We got called to, that day, those days it was West Hunter Street Baptist Church, which was Reverend Abernathy's church. Now West Hunter Street is Martin Luther King Drive in Atlanta. So we were in the basement, and Dr. King came, and Gwen Green, who ran the WCLC, was there, and she was given flowers. Ben Clark was there, Jose was there, and Dr. King was there. And we were told that because we were now on staff, Dr. King wanted to talk to us. So he came out and he gave this wonderful speech, and Jose had all the data of how many registered voters, 49,302, I think it was, kept records of everything, which is in my book, and went over all of our accomplishments and yada, yada, yada. Then he said, I've come out against the war, and I want you to understand it's very controversial. You're now representing our organization, representing me. I want you to be able to explain to people who may ask you why I've done what I've done. Now, Dr. King came out twice against the war. He came out in '65, and he actually had to retrench because there was so much criticism, and his own board was against it. He then kind of kept quiet, and Mrs. King went around to anti-war marches and did anti-war concerts, and she was the spokesperson against the Vietnam War. He then, 2 years later, actually the anniversary of his death, April 4th, 1967, at the Riverside Church in New York, made his statement against the war. So, but he didn't know that he was going to have to retract at that point. At that point, he was out front. He was also up in Chicago much of that summer. So he thanked us, he explained it, and then he said, are there any questions? And then people have often said, he also spoke to us, I'd heard him at UCLA, I heard him at the orientation, but this was in a small group. And there were some people that were in Atlanta, got to spend a lot of time with him. I did not get to spend time with him. A lot of time with Jose, some time with Andy, although not that summer, really. When Andy came out to LA and Jose would come out to LA. No, I never saw Dr. King in LA, but I saw Andy and Jose. So sometimes I was not in town, whatever. I was organizing in Northern California, whatever. But so he said, are there any questions? And you got 20 teenagers who are a little older, kind of awestruck because Martin Luther King has been thanking them. And me, I worked out with the Dodgers, and I was with my heroes many times. And he was one of my heroes, but I was not awestruck enough that, and I've often said, he wasn't the Martin Luther King orator. He was like Martin Luther King, the youth minister, the YMCA coordinator, just very soft-spoken. Knowing, I felt very strongly, and I feel this now, he knew we were in awe of him. He went out of his way and knew how to make people feel comfortable. And he knew he was famous. It wasn't a big thing to him. I mean, that was just part of his job. And he made you feel comfortable. And he just seemed like this nice guy, just like he had seemed at UCLA, which I said in a program with Jose. And everybody else, because Jose was worrying, what am I going to say? We were all supposed to give memories of Dr. King on his show, The Voice of the Crusader. And he knew I didn't know Dr. King. Everybody else did. There were all the SEO veterans. And I just said, I didn't try and wing it. I mean, I don't do that. I didn't try, well, Dr. King, I got to know him. I said, he just was a nice guy. I said, I only heard him that one time close up. And I heard him, he seemed like he was a nice guy. Everybody else, yeah, Dr. King was really a nice guy. Because I said, you think of Dr. King as this famous person. Well, he was a person. And he took him 3 hours to walk from Ebenezer home because he would walk home and talk to everybody along the way. Because he was a nice guy, too. Sometimes he just wanted to be a nice guy. So, and Mrs. King was an extraordinarily nice person. I'm very fortunate to did get to know her and work with her. Wrote a letter to my father when he was ill, which was very meaningful to my father after all I'd been through in jail and the stress. And I'm sure the stress of my being in jail when I was 19 and 20 was not good for my mom. She died a little more than a year later. That's why when Taylor Branch uses the FBI documents and I was in jail, the police chief was Peter Pitchess, who had been an FBI agent, and the FBI knew who I was, and Marcus Crane, who said Sirhan was sane after he killed Robert Kennedy and said I needed to be locked up in a mental hospital because I worked for Martin Luther King. It's extremely personal that Taylor Branch has exploited that FBI terrible period, which the FBI has acknowledged was a terrible period, and the Congress acknowledges he had made money out of the pain that was caused by the FBI. It's very personal to Taylor, and Taylor knows that. Taylor is a coward. I've tried to talk to Taylor about it. I tried to help Taylor, and he trashed Scope. And then he had the nerve to put my name in his notes saying that I helped him with his book. I helped him when he was in Selma, not knowing how to find Martin Luther King III because he wanted to march in the reenactment in 2005, which he had the nerve to say was risking something, which was a joke. It was protected. He said, oh, that was dangerous to march or insinuate. Taylor's great at insinuating. But I have had an argument with Harris Wofford. He says you should get off of Taylor Branch. He doesn't like Taylor. He's let me quote him saying Taylor Branch used too much of the FBI, far too much, without explaining the things. I told Harris just recently, we had an argument about it because Taylor didn't put Harris has criticized Taylor Branch publicly, and he didn't put Harris's name in his new book, although he mentioned the phone call from Kennedy to King, Mrs. King, which Harris set up, and it's called America in the King Years, and you leave out Dr. King's friend who set up the phone call, and he said he did it for brevity. He says in a part, this is the original part that he wrote for this new book, and he cut Harris's name out. And Harris thought I was being too critical. I don't think so. I think it was done intentionally, because Taylor Branch thinks that he's so important, and he's so egotistical, that he gets to decide who's in the movement. And if he doesn't put you in, you're not in. Scope's not in there either. Just like Scope wasn't in Eyes on the Prize. Just like some of the SNCC people don't want to mention Scope anymore. Despite the fact that many SNCC people worked with Scope, whose names are in my book, in our records, because they were arrested with us. And the families that hosted us, of course, were African American. So it's And that's why Sammy Mahone has been so great to have brought Willie Bolden and me and John Lewis and Willie Ricks, who said the Black Power thing, who told me to leave America. Willie was there, said, white boy, we don't want you here. We want you, your only value is to raise money in the North. And that was after Stokely had said 2 months earlier, we're going to sabotage Scope. And some of those people are still following Stokely's admonition from the meeting in Holly Springs, Mississippi in May of 1965, which is in their minutes, which then Ralph Featherston, who I got to know in Berkeley at a teach-in in '67, who got blown up in a car in Maryland. I'm sure he didn't blow himself up. I think those explosives were planted by the government. Ralph said, let's go off record. These files are in the King Center, in the SNCC papers. He says, what do you mean sabotage Dr. King and Scope? And they went off record, and Ralph was against it. Stokely said it. That's Taylor Branch's marching orders. And Stokely himself, or Kwame Ture himself, when he had cancer and late in his life, was with Louis Farrakhan, Minister Farrakhan, in Washington. It's on video. I have not seen it, but I've heard of it. Minister Farrakhan started making negative comments about Dr. King, and when Kwame Ture was in his last months of life, he said, do not say anything bad about Dr. King. He said, we attacked Dr. King many, many times. This is on a video. I don't know where it is. It was filmed when they had a fundraiser for Kwame Ture in Washington. Louis Farrakhan was there. That's what I've been told. And he said, Doctor, we attacked Dr. King all those times. He never attacked us back. Finally, Kwame Ture got the message. Willie Ricks saw me at the 2007. I was late to a thing at the little tiny armory they have there, a dance. And there's been many times I was the only white person there for the last couple hours. Willie noticed me, and black women and I were dancing different ones, and I was having a good time because I was late getting there. I was outside with Willie. I'd seen Willie over the years. Willie spoke at Jose's memorial service. And he said, and Terry Randolph was very close with Jose. And Willie came up to me and he said, I'm Willie Ricks. I'm friends with Terry Randolph, and I was friends with, she worked with Jose. Oh, I said, I know Willie. And he said, we were down here together in '65. I said, oh, I know Willie. I know who you are. I said, I know you. And I was thinking, geez, Willie, it only took 40 years for you to want to be friends. 45 years. Gosh, I'm glad we can be friends now. Because he told me in '65, he said, I hate all white people. He said, a black state trooper in Alabama beat me up, and I hate all white people. And I said, I'm really sorry that happened with the black state trooper. It has nothing to do with me. The black community here has asked us here. Dr. King asked us here. Jose asked us here. And then I went in with another guy, a young guy on Dr. King's staff, and we were working off stress doing 50 sit-ups at a time. And Willie watched us doing the 50 sit-ups, and then he didn't say anything else to me. But he tried to intimidate me. And, hey, Willie, these white people have been shooting at me. You're really going to have kind of a hard time intimidating me. And there was another black guy at a meeting who told me to shut up, that I didn't have a right to speak. And I said, no, I have a right to speak. I'm out in the front line. It was usually the guys, one in the front line, that told the white people they shouldn't be there. Willie was the guy in the flatbed truck with Jose. Willie was yelling Black Power on the Meredith March, and Jose was yelling Freedom Now. And I don't dislike, I'm glad Willie and I can be friends. And I'm glad that just like when Malcolm X made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he saw that there were all different shades of Islam, that he came back and was a changed man and was moving towards Dr. King, which Jackie Robinson writes about in his autobiography, because he knew Malcolm X. And Malcolm had criticized him and was reconciling with him. And I just think that I give all the credit in the world for the SNCC people, for their valor and their courage. And they're in my book, their pictures are in my book, equally to SCLC from the King Center. The Young SNCC group, Young SCLC group, Kwame Ture is in there, Eldridge Cleaver is in there. That's the true history. But you know what? The true history includes the 500 of us who went south, lived with black families, as SNCC wanted us to do. As SNCC said, live in the community, don't come in and out. That was their criticism of Dr. King. So we did just what they wanted, what they did. We made roots. And some of those SNCC scope organizations in a number of communities are still in existence as multi-million-dollar community organizations that started during scope. That process was something that we registered 49,203 voters, many before the Voting Rights Act, and we stood on their shoulders. They were the foundation that we followed. And that instead of resenting us, we're the same. We're together. We're part of them. And some of them are now within these books that are coming out based partly from the reunion I organized. They're now embracing us. Maria Gitten's book in particular about Camden, Alabama, in that county. She interviewed 26 families, many of whom were SNCC, because many of the people that had been with SNCC hosted the Scope families and the Scope volunteers. And that's what I always said, when you cut us out, you cut the families out that we lived with and the people that we marched with. And it was done out of the feeling that Dr. King got all the publicity and they didn't get their fair share. They got plenty of publicity, but I think it was more based on post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress and depression is experienced in many, many, many different variations. I experienced it my way. Believe me, anybody who went through what many of the people in SNCC went through and the Freedom Riders went through. Another criticism was that Dr. King didn't get on the bus in Montgomery and go the rest of the way on a Freedom Ride. Dr. King had 3 children, or 2 children at that time, and a wife. These were single people. I was single. Easier for us to put our lives on the line. We don't have children. We don't have wives. And they criticized him for that. You know what? Time to get over it. It's history. I make no criticism for anything that was done at that time, because when people have their lives on the line under years of stress, people used to go to Atlanta for R&R and they self-medicated. They would go out and drink. That's what soldiers do. That's what soldiers do because of the fear, of the stress. It's okay. That's what I wanted to tell Frank Smith in Washington when he told me, first words out of my mouth, we were tougher than Dr. King when I told him about the son of a bitch thing. No, you were as tough. You didn't have a bullseye on you every day that Dr. King had every day until one day they got him. He knew that. Harris Wofford talks about that his wife, Coretta, talked about that in 56. And he went out every day without any protection. That's pretty good. That's pretty amazing. He was the leader. That doesn't mean that Frank Smith wasn't the leader, that Kwame Ture and Stokely, they were leaders too. They were great leaders. He was the main leader. He had it all. He had the education, he had the oratory, he had the courage, he had the humanity, and he was an African American. Feel proud of him. Embrace him. He was part of you. You were part of him. And the same with Scope. So, but the people I don't like are the David Garrows and the Taylor Branches. And Taylor was not involved and claimed he sat in a jail, so he was arrested. He never went behind bars because he wanted to be like, he said, I heard him on a radio show, wanted to be like Stokely Carmichael, so I got in a black card game. Then he got picked up by the sheriff who didn't want him to get in trouble. And then he sat in the jail, and then he showed his Yale ID, and he went off to his motel. 1969, not part of the era. But he was trying to build his resume. That's what the guy's about. I mean, I'm telling you this because I know the guy. I've dealt with him enough so I don't talk about, and I've said this to his face. I said it in Birmingham at a meeting when he was at the Civil Rights Institute. So I don't talk about people some people didn't like it. I said it there, but Harris has also said it, but much nicer than me, about using the FBI stuff. But anyway, I'm sorry, you wanted to ask a question about being the college coordinator? I can give that real quick. And I would like to talk about the 2401 Southwestern.
Well, let's do that, and then let's wrap up.
Yeah.
We could go for hours, but let's not.
Yeah, no, you've already gone for hours. I appreciate letting me run on because unfortunately this history of Scope has been left out, and the reasons why. I think it's worth talking about. And Sammy Mahone is the model. He was a SNCC leader in Americus, and he's a leader. He's had us both there. He did it before I said it. So I'm following Sammy's lead. He's embracing everybody and being inclusive, and I think it's time we do that. That's a true story. And that involves far more black people than white people. Taylor is right about that. It was a tiny number of Jews, a tiny number of others. Percentage-wise, we are a tiny group, the whites. And even in the black community, although it's a pretty significant part of the black community was involved one way or another. But not everybody, because even then, you were taking big risks. So you want to ask some questions about being the college coordinator?
Well, I was just going to say, maybe just one last thing that you want to say. And then
the college coordinator was, I got back, I walked into the meeting, and Gwen Green, who was the leader, said, because I came back late because I'd been in the South and I went to the first meeting. I got there late. She said, "Oh, our leader is here, or our coordinator is here," and I literally looked behind me to see who she was talking about. So I think what happened was when I raised my hand and talked to Dr. King, he and Jose had talked it over and they decided that I would be the college coordinator. So I protested that I was the youngest one. Gwen said, "No, you've been selected." I later asked her many years, why did I get? He said, "Because we knew you would do a good job. We saw you did good work." So I organized a conference. Jose came out. And the real thing was, scope was kind of ending. Black Power was starting. The anti-war movement was starting. It was very hard to recruit. But Dr. King only had two regional offices. One in D.C. was a lobbying office that Walter Fauntleroy ran. One was the Western Christian Leadership Conference / Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Reverend Thomas Kilgore, who had been in New York, was now out here. He was the president. And it was these ministers around the country that Dr. King had organized back in '57 as the SCLC. And some, at least Kilgore, Reverend Kilgore had come from New York out here. I don't know where he was in '57, but he had been a long-term guy. So we did the conference. We did Operation Breadbasket, where we went when Jesse Jackson was starting in Chicago. We started there. Apparently, I was not quite as charismatic as Jesse, and also he had more SCLC troops there. But we did evaluations and we got jobs. We did exactly the same thing. Went around to the stores in the black areas. How many employees do you have? Worked with the churches. That was a WSCLC scope, SCLC kind of thing out here. But when Andy and Jose would come out periodically, Gwen would call me down there at 2401 South Western Avenue. I think Suite 2, I think it is. It's in the book. Might as well get that address right. 2400 Southwestern Avenue, Suite 102, Los Angeles, California, 90018. It was Thomas Kilgore was the director, Western Bureau, SCLC, which was essentially and then we had Reverend Marvin T. all ministers, Reverend Marvin T. Robinson, president of WCLC, Reverend Stovall, chairman of the board, so they had their own board. It was Western Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. founder. So it was a sort of a separate board, and then it was Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and Mexico, Utah, Alaska, and Hawaii. Gwen Green was the executive director, and she since told me that all the male ministers didn't make it, that she had to fight as a woman. But she was the executive director. She was a woman in the leadership. She was on the payroll. I think she was probably the only one on the payroll. She had a labor background. She later worked for Councilman Bob Farrell, still alive, still in L.A. So that's a great history for that neighborhood. I hope someday we're going to get a marker there, let those schools in that area know, let the ministers in that area know that they're part of the Martin Luther King legacy directly. And Dr. King went to that when he spoke at the sports arena not long before he died. I'm sure he was at WCLC. And, and then, so I did a number of things. I organized a little bit up in Berkeley. I had James Bevel come out. I had this incident where the kids in my neighborhood, these 3 black kids came over. They were like 10, 8, and 6. I talked to their mom. Is it okay if they visit? The landlord said, I want you to move. I said it's against the law to make a threat, but I had told all these white people, I talked about Betty Adams, but the main thing, the white people that didn't want to shoot me came up, and particularly in Macon, not in Americas, they didn't talk to you in Americas. They shot at you, but in Macon they would talk to me, they'd say, "You're a hypocrite, what have you done? Isn't there any problems back in LA?" And of course, once the Watts situation happened, when I was out at Koinonia at the time, I thought, these white people here might have a point. We might have some problems in California. And that was another reason why I told Jose I can't stay. I've got work to do where I live, and so I ended up doing work here. And so, so that stuff was going on, and I organized a little bit up in Northern California. The organization was a big organization. I didn't do anything. I was essentially the Western States College Coordinator, but I was only doing things in Northern and Southern California. And then, so I would know Andy and Jose, that was a key thing. The other thing was, because of being on the staff, when Dr. King made his appeal about Resurrection City 3 years later, he did an appeal that he wrote for Look magazine before he died, that came out after he died, April 4th, that said we need volunteers to go to demonstrate. We've had all these summers of violence in the black sections around the country. We need to channel this into a nonviolent way in Washington at the Poor People's Campaign. And I felt that was worth me going. My dad was very against it. I'd been in jail. I dropped out of school. I'd just gotten back in school. And he didn't want me to go. In fact, he told me, if you go this time, I'm cutting you off. Well, he hadn't given me any money since when I was out of school, and he hadn't given me $100 for the. My dad thought it was like when the tuition was in the 50s. It was, so and he was pretty serious, and I understood why. My mom at that point was ill. They were divorced, but she was, she died that fall. And it was a lot of stress for my family. It's another reason why I resent people who weren't there, like Taylor Branch or David Garrow, cutting out those of us. It wasn't just me, it was my family shared that experience. It was hard on them. My family never ever has. Many of my cousins haven't understood it. The post-traumatic stress I had, they haven't understood. They never even asked me what happened. The Jewish community has never asked me until B'nai B'rith last year. This was a big deal in my life and a big deal in my family's life. I never worried about it not being written about, but when Taylor Branch and David Garrow went out of their way to trash us and disrespect our work and falsify our work with fake documents, that was a little too much for me. For somebody like Taylor Branch, who's my age, who was having a comfortable summer in Atlanta when I was down getting shot at. Walk the walk if you want to talk about that. Willie Ricks walked the walk. The Snake People walked the walk. I'll discuss that with them without a problem. I don't hold it against them. I think we need to bond and be a team together as we were in many places anyway. But anyway, with these kids, they were there. Turned out the landlord was an ex-Santa Monica policeman, which I didn't know at the time. When I went down there, they said, we're not going to do anything. I said, I need somebody to come and take a report. So we're not going to take a report. Because the landlord told him I wasn't telling the truth, and he was an ex-cop. I was really worried because I told you when I came out, I said, I'm not putting up with this anymore. I can't. And I really didn't know. I went and saw my rabbi who had paid my way for me and 4 other Jewish students from UCLA. He said, guns are okay. I mean, he knew about Israel's independence or whatever. He said, if you need protection at your house, you need protection at your house. The first thing you need to do is find out whether there was really a threat. You better call the landlord and see if he's telling the truth. Well, that was a discussion after Friday night services. By the time I called the landlord, it was maybe 9:30, 10 at night on a Friday night. And I had bought a gun. The police told me, if you want any protection, buy a gun. That's when I asked the rabbi, and I bought a gun. I said, can I have a gun? They said, you can have a shotgun if you're over 18. I went down and bought a shotgun. I mean, I'd been through, this was the real deal to me. I mean, I'd been through it. I wasn't about to have that happen again. Not Dr. King would have been happy about it. I'm not sure that Jose would have cared, but so I had the shotgun. I didn't want anything to happen. I talked to the rabbi. I called the landlord, and I said, look, police told me to buy. I didn't know he was an ex-cop at the time. I found that out later. So I didn't know. I said, I don't know. I want to know if this is true. I've talked to my rabbi. The police told me to buy a gun. I'm worried somebody might bomb my place. That's what you told me. Is that true? Were you making that up, or was it true? He hung up at me, called the police, told them that I was threatening people with a shotgun. That's not a good thing. They came down with a city attorney named Herbert Lapine. I'd love to get his name in because he told my dad he was going to put me in jail for life. Put me in jail for life. And I had a gun because I had the gun with me. I didn't have a phone yet. I was too new. I went down to the corner at Santa Monica and 26th Street, called from a phone booth, was walking back. I had taken self-defense from a guy named Briggs Cunt, who was the wrestling coach and an Olympic wrestling coach and a drill instructor from World War II. Once I knew I was going to go, I took self-defense and I paid attention when they taught about guns. I had the gun open, but it was loaded. I mean, and I was walking back. I came in my alley, and there were 2 policemen from Santa Monica with the guns up. They said, "Drop the gun." I said, "It's broken open. We can't be fired." This was Herbert Lapine, the city attorney, was there. And they said, "You have 3. Drop the gun." And I said, "It can't be dropped." He said, 2, and I dropped the gun. Or they would have killed me. Just like you read about all the Black Panthers that got killed. Right. I'd become almost a sympathetic Black Panther in the sense that I wasn't going to take it anymore. Deacon Defense, that's where I was. Not a good place to be. That's where I was. Dropped the gun. They took it. I said, okay, you're here now. Will you take the report about the bomb threat? No. We don't think you're stable enough for the gun. We're taking the gun. I, at that point, wasn't experiencing post-traumatic stress, but I had a depression. By that point, I was feeling fine. I was in really good shape. I had built fences for my uncle all summer and body surfed. I was in great shape. And So they took the gun. They wouldn't take a report. I went back down there, followed them down on my motorcycle. Not, again, a good idea. I was 19. I said, I want you to take the report. They said, get the hell out of here. We're going to put you in. We're going to beat the shit out of you and put you in jail. Get out of here. This was before Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda kind of socialized Santa Monica. It was a different town back then. So this is fall of 66. Went back home. 2 days later, it had been 3 days. I called from a phone booth. I said, look, it's 3 days. I'm calmed down, but I'd like my property back. I told them, I said, okay, take the gun. I want a property receipt. They wouldn't even give me a property receipt. Essentially, they stole my gun. So I couldn't be a very good Black Panther without my gun. I'm joking about the black. I didn't use that terminology, but essentially I was doing what later people did when they got frustrated with injustice and brutality. So I was at the same phone booth, and they said, okay, where are you? I told them at the phone booth, we'll bring it down to you. Cop car comes down, guy jumps out, and I'm in the thing. I said, oh, you brought me my gun. They said, no, you're under arrest. Again, in the phone booth, like in the South. It's what Bob Zellner calls up north. I said, what am I under arrest for? They said, you're disturbing the peace. I said, you're not going to make that stick. I'm in the phone booth. They said, I'll make it stick. And the guy grabbed me and twisted my arm and started pulling me to the car. I said, take your fucking hands off me. I said, you can arrest me, but don't touch me. And so then he came at me, and I went in the car. And that's when I told him, I said, we're going to the station. I said, when you get out of this car, I said, don't touch me. I said, you can put me in jail. Do not touch me. He said, he said, if I have to use my ability, he said, I'm going to do what I have to do. I said, if I have to hit you, I'll hit you. I said, you have to use your ability club, me, motherfucker. Excuse the language, but this is what was going on in my mind. And I got out of the car right behind the booking room at the Santa Monica station, still, I think, it's still there, right off the freeway. And he came at me, and I was, like I said, I was in very good shape. I had self-defense. I knocked him down, jumped on him. I did learn, and the jail psychiatrist later told me, that is not a good thing to do, to hit a policeman outside a booking room at a police station. Because I was on top of him, and then 4 police, they came out of the station pretty quickly when they hear that's going on, when their officers is down. And 4 officers each one grabbed legs and arms and pulled me off, threw me over and banged my head on the ground until I passed out. I had told them once they had me spread eagle, I was stopping. I said, okay, and they kept smashing my head on the ground until I passed out. Woke up, they brought me in, and they punched me around. Then I said, okay, you got me here? You got me for disturbing the peace? I'm going to sue you. No, they're not good. You really tell them that later. And they said, well, you know what? You promised to move out of town, we'll let you go. That's when I should have said yes. Again, 19 years old, so I said, no, I'm going to sue you. I said, I'm a civil rights worker, I'm going to sue you. Put me in jail, and they charged me, instead of disturbing the peace, they charged me with a 653 MAPC of the Penal Code. I'm not sure that it exists anymore. It's a threatening or obscene phone call. They said that I threatened them over the phone, that I threatened the police department over the phone, which was not true. But nobody can prove what anybody says unless they have it on tape. So, but then they never thought I was ever going to have to go to trial, and they dropped charges from that. They put what they call a Department 95, which is a psychiatric hold, which is then a pathway to institutionalization, commitment. And that's what they tried to do. So what happened was they sent me to a guy named Ronald Markman, who's still alive, became a very famous jail psychiatrist, and have written a book at UCLA, and he's in Westwood. And he saw me, and he was a very cool guy. He was in his 30s at the time. And he said, what are you doing here? You're a UCLA student. I said, well, this is what happened. He said, okay. He said, you're not crazy. I'm going to give you a clearance so you can, because my parents couldn't bail me out. Well, you got a Department 95, you can't even get bail. My parents were going to bail me out. They couldn't get me out. And so he said, you can get bailed out. He said, but I'm telling you 2 things. Number 1, I said, he said, I understand. You're probably going to want to protest the Vietnam War. But I'm going to tell you, never hit a cop. And particularly never at a booking room. He says, okay, you're okay, go. So I got bailed out, and I couldn't live in the place, so I went to stay with my girlfriend, and something happened with her, and my ex-roommate, guy from the co-op UCLA, came by, got an argument with him. He called the police. He told them that I was out on bail on the other. They rearrested me for battery, which was bogus, but the 2 city attorneys got together. They then held me in jail 112 days, and I called Jose. Actually, I tried to get to Atlanta. I got kicked off a Delta airline plane. Jose said, come down here. We can't do anything for you there. I said, the media won't take the story. Come down here. And I actually got kicked off the plane. They sent me back because I told them I worked for Martin Luther King. Not the same Delta Airlines either. I told the stewardess I worked for Martin Luther King, and they kicked me off the plane. Just like in the Jackie Robinson movie, they kicked him off the plane. Same thing happened to me. I have a lot of little intersections with Jackie Robinson, it seems. So anyway, to make the long story short, they immediately, when they found out my mother was a professor at USC, my father was a prominent chiropractor. He was the National Public Relations Chair for the National Chiropractic Association, had been on the Today Show, was very prominent at that time. So they offered me a deal. We'll drop charge. You sign a stipulation of probable cause, so you can't sue us, and we'll drop the threatening phone call charge. I wouldn't do it, which pissed my dad off. And then they would not let me, so then they brought me to trial to the other one, and the city attorney came down and lied to me and said witnesses were going to be there that weren't there. I got convicted by a judge, a guy named Woodmansey, who was a liberal judge, of misdemeanor battery and disturbing the peace. And they then put me up for another Department 95. So in the jail at that time, they had one chief jail psychiatrist. That was Marcus Crane. He was a colleague of Peter Pitchess, who was a colleague of J. Edgar Hoover. Marcus Crane wrote a terrible report, they told me, about me. Same guy that 2 years later said Sirhan was not sick for killing, was completely sane when he killed Bobby Kennedy. So I thought that was interesting. I was sick for having attacked a policeman who had attacked, or defended myself against a policeman, but Sirhan was sane. So finally, I went back to Markman. He said, "What are you doing here again?" I said, "Well, I got arrested again. They're messing with me." "Okay, I'm going to certify you again." But he said, "You got to start being careful here. You're getting arrested too much." And so then they took me to court, and they said, "We want to send him back again." They wouldn't try me on the second charge, or on the first charge. They sent me to all the jail psychiatrists. They had 10 of them. When I got to the 8th one, he told me, and they had to have 2. They had to have Cran, the head guy, and one other one, and then they could put me up for commitment. They would never have to try me for the criminal charge. So they started telling, the last couple of psychiatrists, they told me, they said, "We know Dr. Markman, we've seen his report." When they talked to me, they said, "You're not crazy." They said, "But you better be careful. They are trying to put you away and throw away the key. You are in trouble now. You got to start being more careful and take this more seriously and not get arrested again when you get out." So finally, they could never get the second guy. So they finally had and they kept taking continuances on the threatening phone call. Yeah. My dad, and when I went to court after the third continuance, Herbert Lapine said to my dad, "I'm going to put him away for life." And that's when my dad said, "Over my dead body." But he was just he was trying to be a chiropractor and a leader in his field, and he had been a long struggle after World War II out of the projects. He was just remarried and doing well, and here's his son, and all this stuff. So finally, I go back to court on the sentencing for the battery, and they say, "We're going to let you out, but you have to be committed." And I said, "I'm not going to be committed. I just went to your psychiatrist, and 8 out of 9, or 9 out of 10, they sent me to 10. 9 out of 10 said I don't need to be committed. Why would I want to commit myself?" So then Judge Woodmansey said, "Okay, 6 months in jail." And I had already been in 2 months back to jail. But at that time, I didn't cause any trouble in jail. Before I flooded the jail, I had stopped a black Muslim Nation of Islam guy beating up a Hispanic guy, which he then later, they put him in the same cell block, and he hit me with a bar soap with a razor blade in it, cut open my eye. Was trying to kill me. He kicked me in the head with his boots. The funny part of that was there was quite a bit of blood, and when they took me in to sew me up, some of the deputies came in who then kind of liked me because they thought I was kind of tough and I wasn't causing too many more problems, because I had decided I would go back to jail instead of going to a mental hospital. So they said, "Leventhal, we knew somebody was going to get you." And I think he was put up to it by then. And I said, "Well," they said, "we knew somebody was going to get you." I said, "Well," they said, "Yeah, he busted open your eye. You're getting stitched up." I said, "Well, I know I got a few on him." And they said, his name was Hugo Maxey. He was on parole hold from Soledad. He was a tough guy. When I got down, he kicked me. I threw him over me, which I learned from Briggs Hunt. Got up and kicked me in the head with big boots. And that's when I realized this is not a regular fight. This guy's trying to kill me. So I got up and I defended myself. I was on my feet when it ended. So they said, I said, "Well, I know I got a few in with him. Didn't he have some injuries?" And they said, "The only thing we noticed with Hugo Maxey, some of his knuckles were bruised. That seemed to be the only damage you did with him." Anyway, so what happened was, to finish it out, I go back to court. So then they hear that, so I finally got to go back to court on the original charge of disturbing the peace. This is now 3.5 months later, or 112 days later. And they have no more psychiatrists to send me to. They've run out. They can't do the Department 95. So they make a deal with the Judge Woodmansey, And the day before I'm supposed to go back to Santa Monica, or that week, they bring me back to West LA and they say, we're going to commute your 6 months to time served, but we just want you to have outpatient counseling. And my dad tells me, take this. And at that point, I realized I wasn't going to have publicity and it wasn't going to change things. It wasn't going to clean up the LAPD, which we know have had a few problems since then and needed to get cleaned up, and the corruption within the DAs. So I took that deal. They let me out of jail. Then I went back and they were still offering me the stipulation of probable cause and dropped the charges on the Santa Monica one. And my dad told me, sign the document. I want to be done with this. And I signed it, and which made me very depressed. And I've never forgotten that experience in our justice system. And that's why I have great sympathy for those, for example, in SNCC or the Black Panthers, who felt that the system, and I'm a middle-class white guy, upper middle class. Dad's a doctor, mom's a USC professor at this point. If they can do that to me, think what they can do to a poor black person and what they still do. We have in our country, this is the final thing I'll say, we have something called stipulation. They've changed from stipulation of probable cause, which you have to sign, to something you have no choice to sign, which is called arguable probable cause and qualified immunity. And that is why the Innocence Project is having to free and is so overloaded with so many people incarcerated, because the same prosecutor like Herbert Lapine, who wanted me to sign something, they later became judges, and they put in a thing about 20 years ago, which Alan Dershowitz has written about and others, that it's called arguable probable cause and qualified immunity, which means a government can put you in jail and you can't sue them because they don't have complete immunity, but they call it qualified immunity. But all they need to trigger qualified immunity is arguable probable cause, and anything is arguable. I had a civil rights case in Iowa, which I'm not going to go into the details of, where a judge found on a disturbing the peace charge, a disorderly conduct, similar to the one of the guy at Harvard, the scholar. He didn't sue. I did sue. They dropped the charges, but I sued them because I'm not a civil rights educator, a Harvard professor. I'm a real civil rights worker, unlike, I forget his name. He never was a civil rights worker, but he's a famous civil rights scholar. That's the difference between the scholars and the workers. We follow through. He never sued them, the Cambridge police. I sued the State Patrol in Iowa. The judge found my Fourth Amendment right was violated. There was no probable cause. He found the state trooper, who was 6'6", 240 pounds, and I believe anti-Semitic. I was out at the Des Moines Register bike ride, which I'd done 20 times. And I was trying to stop some drunks from harassing me and other people, and he believed the drunks who weren't Jewish but targeted me, and I was. And I did mention that I was a civil rights worker to him. And he also found the guy's story incredible, but arguable, and so he let him off. He let him off, and that's the next civil rights thing and I appealed to the Supreme Court. They wouldn't hear the case. That's why so many innocent people are going to court, and that qualified immunity needs to be changed. I will end with that, and that's my current civil, and that's what the Innocence Project is about. And they were supporting me informally on what I do. My little story.
All right. Well, we literally got to the end of the tape. So.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.